The question of why she betrayed him echoes in the young man's mind as he watches his beloved in the arms of another man, who casually mentions that it took him some time to break into his house. Because the world had already ended, there was no longer a civilized society, and power ruled everything. The girl says that strength dictated the rules and that he should understand and not bring shame. So, the man grabs his baton and prepares to strike, while the young man asks what he intends to do with him. 28 weeks after the world turned to ice, humanity lay buried beneath layers of snow. A man steps onto the frozen surface, leaving footprints, and an elderly man, nearly frozen, watches him as the boy passes by with a backpack. He removes his mask and inhales the cold air, saying that it seemed no one had explored this area yet, as comforts like food and fuel had become scarce and precious. The young man looks down from a cliff, noticing that the ice layers were deeper and assuming it should be safe there. However, the ground suddenly begins to tremble. He turns, saying this was bad, wondering if it was an earthquake. The frozen world was God's way of saying that human civilizations were as fragile as layers of ice. Then, the young man plunges headfirst into an icy abyss, realizing that if he falls, he will lose his life. He grabs his equipment and tells himself not to give up now. Securing himself against the ice wall, barely managing to stay on his feet, he thinks he isn't slowing down fast enough. Eventually, he crashes onto an old store. Lying on the ground, he smiles, saying that he landed in snow and would have died if it had been solid. After all, as the saying goes, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Looking ahead, he appears anxious, because the scariest thing in this frozen world was a three-eyed creature, which some call the White Skins, monsters that see humans as prey. The young man is about to finish his sentence, but is startled by white armor. He immediately flees, thinking that he is still far from being safe. A parasite crawls along the ice stalactites hanging from the ceiling. Just as the white armor is about to seize the young man, the ice stalactites are severed. They shoot toward the demonic creature, piercing its head before it can harm the boy. He wonders if it was just a collapse caused by the commotion, but quickly changes the subject. Either way, he was safe. Snow begins falling again above him. The boy shouts that more were coming. However, the snow only falls beside him. He is buried under the snow and sighs in relief, thankful to be safe. Yet he is now trapped as the parasite slithers toward him, creeping closer to his arm, which is stuck in the snow, and then merging with him, making the boy wake up suddenly, but with one of his eyes now a different shade. Kneeling in the snow, he asks what just happened. However, a blue vein had spread along his neck. Either way, he had been outside for quite a while now. Then he notices a chocolate bar and says he can't return empty-handed. He needs to hurry. Amidst a massive frozen structure, he reflects that with most streets buried beneath layers of ice, he should return using tunnels, but he isn't sure how much longer he can continue living this way, since it wasn't any better than living inside the buildings, where many people had been trapped when the disaster struck, and with resources running low, no one knows what could happen next. After all, not everyone could avoid crossing the line. He approaches a corridor and looks around cautiously. Noticing that no one is patrolling there, he should get home quickly. Knocking on the door of apartment 409, a girl with two buns in her hair opens the door. The young man asks why Ming opened the door like that, but the girl quickly embraces him, saying she really wanted to see him. She asks if he missed her, and he nods, saying he did. But he also wants to know if she locked the door, to which the girl dramatically asks if locking a door is more important than his girlfriend. The boy pulls out a chocolate bar, saying he found it for her, handing it over. She is surprised and asks what it is. Soon realizing that it's a chocolate bar, she hugs her boyfriend tightly, screaming that she loves him so much. Pulling back, the girl asks if that's all, and the young man explains that he nearly got eaten by a monster to get it, so she should hurry up and eat. However, the boy's backpack is stained with blue blood. Growing suspicious of her partner, the girl breaks the chocolate bar. Sitting before a fire, he says he hasn't found anything decent in the past few days, wondering if he should eat all the seeds he managed to gather, because he had planted them all, but none had grown. However, if he ate them now, he might be sabotaging his future. So he sits on the chair anxiously, saying he would go crazy at this rate. The boy picks up a piece of meat and says that if eating this was safe, then the people here wouldn't need to tolerate their enemies anymore. He throws the meat into the fire, turning it blue as he remarks that it was highly flammable and a good fuel source. Seeing a broken clock, he wonders if it was Valentine's Day. Scratching his head, he reflects on whether he had forgotten about it, but he walks toward his girlfriend, apologizing for forgetting, only to fail in finding her. Outside the door, the boy hears a strange sound. That was the signal he had planned with Ming Ming, and he wonders what she was doing outside. So he quickly opens the door, only for a bat to come flying toward him, hitting his face with full force. The boy is sent flying in an instant. Then, the intruder steps into his home and wishes him a Merry Christmas, asking what he thought of the surprise while holding Ming in his arms. The boy asks if Chen Ming really betrayed him with Lu Dalong, but the girl yells that he still wanted to know the reason when he had deceived her first with one of his chocolate bars, because he had been stockpiling food and had a large backpack for it. Lu Delong slams his bat against the ground and apologizes to his little friend Mo, saying that he should at least give him a small warning. Since the world was over and now everything was ruled by strength, the weak couldn't even protect a woman. He had two choices: trust the strong or become food. And now Mo should hand over whatever food he had. The boy asks how it would be possible to hide anything from him, but Lu Delong doesn't believe him and declares that this would be the end for him, striking his leg with the bat, then hitting the boy's face, knocking out one of his teeth, even breaking his arm. It was a horror scene as they beat him until he lost his life. Completely injured, one of DeLong's subordinates searches the entire house but finds almost nothing. DeLong says they should be more thorough, demanding a knife. Then he cuts Mo while he still lies there. Lifeless, Mo reflects that what he feared most had happened. If he had another chance, he would make them pay because he wanted to live. And so, an entity grants his wish. Mo wakes up in an office, his computer still on. His eyes suddenly open, screaming Lu Delong's name and wondering what just happened, because he had just lost his life, but now he had no injuries at all. There were only 28 hours left before the world froze over. With violent protests erupting in the streets, the police department had deployed a massive force to contain them. At the same time, the elites of Manhattan were drinking with their companions, and the gangs were making deals in the deepest parts of Brooklyn, because no one in that city knew what was about to happen, except for him, who had gone back in time. People admired the northern lights in the sky, but the boy already knew that they were a prelude. Then he looks at his phone, thinking that the only person who would call him at this hour was his girlfriend Ming Ming. He remembers her calling him weak, so he reflects that he had never noticed her true nature, someone who betrayed him in such a way. Thus he decides that he will cut her out of his life. He answers his girlfriend's call. She asks if he is working hard right now because the aurora looks beautiful, and she asks her boyfriend to send her some money, since her credit card was frozen. Mo, however, tells her that they are breaking up and that she should stop calling him from now on, leaving the girl in shock, but he simply deletes her contact from his phone. As he walks, he reflects that now that he has a second chance, the girl who made him lose his life should just freeze along with everyone else. On the Brooklyn neighborhood bridge, the time was 11:58 p.m. as the boy says that for this opportunity, he needs to prepare properly. In his past life, within the next 24 hours when the world froze, the temperature would drop to 0, and he had 28 hours. In theory, it seemed like a lot of time, but what people would do would only bring chaos and collapse, so realistically, he needed to gather as many resources as possible within an hour. Besides daily necessities, he needed equipment for self-defense amid this chaos, so he planned to look for something like a pistol. Police officers saw the boy walking and said he looked suspicious wandering around at this hour, so they should work together to apprehend him. One of them stepped out of the car and called out to Mo, ordering him not to move. Pointing his gun at him, he commanded Mo to place his hands where he could see them. His partner spoke into the radio, reporting that they had a suspect on 4th Avenue, while the officer asked what he had in his hand. Meanwhile, the young man analyzed the officer's confusion. He said he was just holding his phone, but the countdown hit 0, and he reflected that he didn't have time to waste on a pig like the officer, so he prayed that they would let him go after an inspection. The officer warned him that at an hour like this, he shouldn't approach without caution. Meanwhile, his partner asked what was in the backpack and told him to hand it over. Mo explained that it was just things from his office job, pulling a blue notebook from his bag. In a panic, the officer screamed that it was a weapon and fired a shot at Mo. The bullet raced toward the boy without mercy. The young man thought this was it. His chance to live was about to end here, but then he denied that thought, telling himself he would survive. His eye began to glow with electric blue streaks. An aura surged around Mo as the bullet approached. The young man wondered what was happening, because he could see the bullet's trajectory, questioning whether time had slowed down for him. So he tilted his head to the side, realizing he could dodge it, and it wasn't an illusion. He cursed the officer, saying he was a citizen and the cop had no right to shoot him. Then he rushed toward the officer, saying he couldn't waste time on fools. The bullet missed and struck the ground. Instantly, thin layers of ice formed over it. Mo moved so fast toward the officer that he left trails behind him, landing a punch to his face, shattering his jaw and making him spit blood. The officer collapsed onto the ground next to his overweight partner. The second officer trembled as he looked behind him, seeing his friend completely wrecked from the impact. Wanting to know what the hell had just happened and what had done that to him, the officer fell to the ground in terror, pointing his gun at Mo. He demanded to know what the hell he was, but the young man calmly approached the man, saying that even he didn't know what he was, and then a single scream echoed through the Brooklyn streets. After the incident, the overweight officer reported over the radio that an officer was down and a suspect had fled with their firearm. He repeated his call, urging the station to respond. As a trail of blue energy formed ahead of him, he muttered that his day was cursed. Leaving a glowing trace behind him, Mo sprinted away, heading toward his home in apartment 409, and collapsing onto the floor as the energy dissipated behind him. The young man took deep breaths, shaken, wondering if what had just happened was real, wanting to know how he had managed to do all of that. Then he picked up the gun, determined to test whether he could do it again. He aimed the pistol at the mirror and fired a shot. His ice power activated, turning one of his eyes cyan. Mo suddenly moved forward, catching the bullet in his hand. He grinned excitedly as he realized what he had just done, wondering if he had awakened some kind of superpower. Looking at his shoulder, which was covered in ice, he questioned why, since the global freeze hadn't even started yet. Could it be because he moved with the bullet? Like a supersonic jet, perhaps? He concluded that this ability affected his speed. It might not seem too sophisticated on paper, but with his knowledge of the apocalypse, he was already one step ahead of everyone. A knock came at the door, making him turn to see who was looking for him. It was an elderly woman named Mrs. Fang. She questioned little Mo about what that gunshot was. The young man made up an excuse, saying it was just his TV, that he had broken the remote and apologized for the noise. But the woman sighed, reminding him not to forget what had happened at the nearby supermarket. The streets weren't safe, so he should be careful. Mo thanked her and apologized for worrying her, but she simply returned to her apartment, saying that young people shouldn't overwork themselves, and then she closed the door to Mo's apartment. The young man quickly shifted his focus back, returning to the main problem of resources. Remembering the supermarket that the old lady mentioned, he realized it might have everything he needed for the apocalypse. So, with a wicked smile, he decided he would stockpile his food. At the supermarket, the cashier yawned quickly while a security camera recorded the shelves. It captured only Mo looking at the food, but in the blink of an eye, he vanished into a blur. The girl didn't even notice, continuing to yawn in exhaustion. But then, an enormous receipt appeared on her screen. She wondered what it was, and if someone had made a purchase. Reading a note at the bottom, she saw a message telling her not to be scared and to go home to stay safe. That made the girl question the strange receipt. First they were robbed, and now they were receiving odd messages upon checkout. However, at the same time, two men entered the store. One of them had a pistol in his hand. The girl sighed, wondering what was going on these days. But then, the man pointed the gun at her head and apologized, because this was a robbery and she needed to hand over all the money in the register. He told her to hurry up while an icy aura crept toward the store. The gun began to freeze from the cold. Then, the entire store followed, coated in frost. A leg stepped inside as one of the robbers asked why it suddenly got so cold. His partner ordered him to turn toward the door, so he did, and came face to face with a tall, slender white armor. The thief demanded to know what the hell that thing was, what kind of monster it was. His partner immediately fired at the creature, but the bullets simply curved around its bluish blood. The thief screamed that they couldn't kill something like this, firing again as the creature's hand reached for him. The monster grabbed the thief while commenting on his face, slowly peeling off his skin with its fingers. Then it ripped off the man's face, saying he tasted bad. The cashier held up her phone, determined to record this. A video captured the monster devouring the thief. Police officers watched the girl's livestream on their phones, commenting that this format was popular. But then, an error message appeared on the screen, making them wonder if it was a government emergency alert. Suddenly, alarms blared throughout the city, warning all citizens. Mo opened his door, hearing that this was a broadcast from the Department of Logistics and Security for the Homeless. He was surprised it was starting already. The city was experiencing an unexplained cold wave, and everyone was instructed to shut their doors and windows. The cold wave was coming, and Brooklyn would be the first to suffer. An hour and 9 minutes had already passed since the beginning. Inside Building 58 of the new district, in an ordinary apartment, the alert urged citizens to pay attention. It repeated that this was a message from the Department of Logistics. Meanwhile, Officer Joe commented that it must be serious if they were getting involved. A girl smoked a cigarette while watching the alarm on her phone, and Mo used a screwdriver, thinking that there wouldn't be any setbacks. Lou DeLong flicked his lighter and asked if the man wasn't going to talk. Beaten and bloodied, the man weakly said he truly didn't know anything. So DeLong pulled out his phone, asking if he still didn't recognize it, demanding to know what was in that photo, because he had drugged the boss's daughter. The man sobbed, insisting he didn't know at the time. But DeLong crouched down, telling him that he should start praying, so at least God might have mercy on him. Then he stretched out the man's hand and drove a knife through it. He mentioned something about counting from 1 to 5 inside his box. Inside the box were 6 severed fingers. One of the henchmen asked DeLong what they should do with this guy, but the young man said that the sin of lust deserved death by fire, so they should throw him into the boiler. The subordinates hurled his body inside. Then they sealed it shut. One of them muttered that the boiler was old and might explode, but the other told him to shut up. Lua was waiting for them. However, the henchman near the boiler suddenly noticed something was wrong. A massive explosion erupted from the apartment. His friend grabbed onto his arms while his partner cursed, covering himself in the growing shadow. The screwdriver slowed to a stop. Mo declared that the plant cultivation structure was finally complete. With his current supplies, even if he didn't leave, he could survive for quite a while. But it still wasn't enough, because supplies would eventually run out, and sustainable self-sufficiency was the key. His plan was to build the perfect survival chamber, one that could sustain itself indefinitely. He picked up his phone, noting that the freezing phenomenon had been going on for almost an hour now, and he needed to hurry, because this was the time to speed things up, since in this world, time was life. But then, a knock came at his door, and the young man wondered what it could be. As he opened it, he questioned why the sensation felt so familiar. Officer Joe apologized to Mr. Mo for disturbing him. Mo then asked old Joe what the problem was, wondering what was going on. Joe explained that the temperature had suddenly dropped, and the heating system was broken, so he was warning everyone to stay safe. Mo remembered something happening last week. The malfunction wasn't fixed in time, and when he had gone to repair it, it was already completely broken. He couldn't repeat the same mistake, he had to fix it, so he asked the officers to let him take a look. Then he closed the apartment door behind him. Climbing the stairs, the officers asked where he was going, and Mo asked if the boiler room wasn't supposed to be here. Joe explained that the boiler was in the basement. They needed to go downstairs. Mo reflected on how the boiler room was illegal in the apartment complex. Fang had mentioned it before, so it should be upstairs. He wondered if he was developing early amnesia. Inside the basement, Joe commented on how cold it was. Then Mo noticed something strange about the smoke. It felt like cold air. Joe led him toward the boiler. Mo tinkered with it, saying it should be fine now. But then he noticed a blue liquid on his hand and wondered what it was. Joe's partner asked if there was a problem, and at that moment, 2 white skins appeared behind him, exploding his head while screaming for fingers, saying that they were growing back. Mo questioned how this could be a white armor, while Joe panicked, asking what the hell that thing was. Overcome with terror, he was paralyzed. The white armor prepared to attack. Mo activated his ability immediately, dashing in front of Joe and pushing him down to prevent the white armor from striking him. Then he sprinted away, muttering that old Joe had almost lost his head. He noticed that the door was still open, so he bolted toward it. If he ran at full speed, he could escape. But the white armor caught up, right behind them with its mouth wide open. Mo wondered how it could keep up with his speed. Then, the monster nearly struck him. Mo questioned if this was happening because he was carrying old Joe, so he picked him up in his arms, apologizing mentally, because he would have to throw him toward the door. Then he hurled old Joe with all his strength. Joe went flying, shouting, "What the hell is going on?" Crashing outside, knocked unconscious. Mo turned back toward the white armor, but the monster attacked with its head. The young man panted as he dodged the blow. That white armor kept repeating the word finger. Mo wondered if his power was connected to old Joe, trying to understand why this was happening and how his ability worked. He recalled holding old Joe and realizing that without him, his speed increased, but his ability was limited. The monster turned to attack again. Lin Mo blocked the strike, saying that his condition had nothing to do with the white armor, because it was clear that when he threw old Joe, something strange happened due to his energy activation. He wondered if there was some kind of connection between them. Noticing the pebbles on the ground, Mo finally understood his condition. In his past life, humans faced the white armors with no chance of survival, so all he could think about was running. But now things were different. Now he was the hunter, and no longer the prey. Mo grabbed a stone from the ground. This time, he wasn't running. He readied an attack, gripping the pebble in his hand, taking a baseball stance, charging his energy into the throw. Then he hurled it toward the creature. Mo's assumption was correct, just as he thought, because his ability could only affect targets contaminated by his energy. With kinetic acceleration, the energy amplified, and even a tiny stone, when sped up to a certain degree, carried the power of an electromagnetic railgun. Blood splattered onto the ground. It was dripping from Mo's eye. He questioned what was happening, noticing that his blood was blue, and wanting to know what the hell was going on. Mo collapsed onto the ground, vomiting blood, falling unconscious, unable to move. His last thought was about how cold he felt. But before his vision completely darkened, old Joe approached, holding the young man, calling him Lin, and telling him to open his eyes. Inside Joe's house, his wife commented that the wind was too strong. At this rate, they couldn't take him to a hospital. Meanwhile, the boys struggled to get the main door open. Joe ordered them to block the wind and turn on the heating. His wife worriedly remarked that the boy looked poisoned. As they shouted for him not to fall asleep, the officer found Mrs. Fang and started talking about Lin Mo, but the woman cut him off, telling him to stop talking and go find Xiao Zhu. Xiao Zhu approached, asking Joe to excuse him. She told Joe to leave Lin Mo there, and Joe commented that the boy would be fine. The doctor continued, saying the officer should check the stairs because it was a mess, and despite his body temperature being so low, he was still alive. She wondered if he was some kind of cryogenic person. The doctor began recording a report, stating that the male patient was suspected of poisoning and was still in a coma. His vital systems were abnormal, and his body temperature was around 10 degrees Celsius, but his pulse and nerve reflexes were in normal condition. She turned off the phone, saying it was unbelievable. The blood separation process was complete, and she needed to check the result. She realized it was something she had never seen before, because before centrifuging, the blood looked no different from normal blood, but afterward, blue impurities were separated. Since the analysis would take time, she needed to continue observing the patient's surface characteristics. Even on his body, if not looked at closely, the markings could be mistaken for veins, but upon closer inspection, they resembled an allergic reaction. Suddenly, Lin Mo opened his eyes. The doctor asked if he had finally woken up, while the young man tried to understand what was happening to him. The woman continued, telling him not to walk around like a headless chicken, while Lin Mo wanted to know who she was. Xiao Zhou lit a cigarette, saying she was an unlicensed doctor and for some reasons couldn't reveal her real name, but he could call her Dr. Zhu. She then asked how he ended up in that state, because to be honest, she had never seen these symptoms before and wanted to know what had happened in the basement. She was very interested in him. In Brooklyn, the temperature had dropped to minus 29 degrees Celsius. The world record for the lowest human body temperature was 13.7 degrees Celsius. While the human body could tolerate 0 degrees Celsius, prolonged exposure froze tissue and destroyed cells. Temperatures below 32 degrees Celsius caused hypothermia, and humans couldn't survive in minus 29 degrees Celsius or with a body temperature lower than 13.7 degrees Celsius. After explaining this, the doctor removed the thermometer from Mo's mouth, telling him to take a look. His current body temperature was 11.5 degrees Celsius. It was a miracle he was still alive. Lin Mo could only wonder how this was possible, trying to figure out if it was because of his ability. But he didn't have time to dwell on it. He needed to complete his plan quickly. Dr. Zhou smirked, saying she understood. Lin Mo then slipped on the water on the floor, falling and hitting his head as Zhu turned around, annoyed, telling him that she had ordered him not to move since his body was weak. But that wasn't the real issue. She had discovered what was wrong with him. She asked if he had a superpower, shocking the boy, who wondered how she knew. However, he didn't have time to waste on her. He scoffed, asking what kind of joke this was. But Zhou explained that she had been observing him as a doctor. The young man thought that as long as his ability was active, even if he had to climb everything again, it would be faster. But then blue blood dripped onto the floor. The doctor asked if he was okay as he coughed up blood. He realized he couldn't accelerate now, and based on his past experiences, he knew what was about to happen. Meanwhile, DeLong walked toward a door, saying that after meeting with Dr. Zhu, they needed to behave a little better. His subordinates understood. Then he stopped in front of apartment 509. Inside were Zhu and Lin Mo. The young man was startled, wondering what was about to happen. But Zhu gritted her teeth and told him to get up. He needed to move, asking for Lin's hand. Lin sat up on the stretcher, asking what the problem was, but the doctor ordered him to lie back down. There was no more room for questions. The young man needed to understand why all of this was happening so suddenly. Zhou told him that if he wanted to survive, he had to do exactly what she said, telling him to wait and not move under any circumstances. Then she pressed the button to open the door. Lu Delong stepped inside, apologizing for the intrusion. He was greeted by Dr. Zhu, who asked what he wanted. The man asked if he could come in for a quick chat, and the woman told him to do as he pleased. Inside the house, Zhu asked what he needed. The gangster explained that he had heard the resident of apartment 409 was receiving treatment and had something to discuss with him. Zhao replied that the person he was looking for had died from poisoning. DeLong simply sighed, saying that was unfortunate. Lin Mo recognized Lu DeLong's voice and wondered why he had appeared here, if in his previous life he had been completely frozen before showing up. If he could use his acceleration ability now, he could take DeLong's life himself. The gangster notices something strange and turns around, saying that Dr. Zhao had been working hard all this time, but he had seen the patient blink, so he wanted to be sure that he was lifeless and asked what she thought about him helping to check. Zhou says that she had already told him the truth. Then DeLong presses the ignition of her lighter, saying that the doctor had saved so many of his brothers on the street, and there was no way to repay her, because it was his fault and the woman shouldn't be upset. But she shouldn't forget who was taking care of the clinic and her, so she should give a quick answer about something. Then he leaves the apartment, telling her to think about it, and Ju complains that it was nonsense, but she tells Lin Mo to get up because DeLong had already left, and she thought he had many questions to ask. Lin Mo asks why DeLong wanted to take his life this time since there was no reason like in the past life, and also why Zhou was protecting him. But before anything else, he asks the doctor where his clothes were, and she wonders if that would really be his first question. Brooklyn reaches minus 40 degrees Celsius. One of DeLong's henchmen comments that when he was young, he watched his father take care of the furnace and felt that he couldn't be a loser like him, but now he admires him. His friend replies that it was just the messed up weather outside, and he didn't need to lament over his father. DeLong asks if he thought everything would improve in a few days, and the subordinate apologizes. But the man adds that government messages used to be broadcast every 20 minutes, and now even the internet has stopped, as if they had given up. So this sudden cold wave must be God's punishment for humanity. Joe, who is tied up, asks why God doesn't punish a sinner like him then. DeLong approaches and says he was just managing the apartment and wanted to know if the order he created wasn't harmonious. But the officer complains that he ordered everyone to leave and get supplies for him, or else he would cut off the heating. The gangster asks if it wasn't fair since it was an equivalent exchange. Joe simply calls him a parasite. DeLong turns around, saying it was a shame Lin wasn't among them. Otherwise, he could be benefiting from someone else, leaving Joe in shock because of that. Joe asks if Lin was already dressed and tells him to come to her when he's done, but the young man was struggling even to get dressed. He asks what she needed, and the doctor wanted to know if he had any idea how long he had been unconscious. The young man guesses 6 hours, but she replies that it had been 6 whole days, completely surprising him as she explains everything that happened during those days. Since DeLong controlled the heating system, forcing residents to trade supplies for it, many people were forced to go outside, which was the same as losing their lives willingly since those who went out thought they were going to heaven anyway. Lin Mo curses him, saying that no matter where he was still a beast. Then he asks if there was any way to recover his body. Joe smiles while the cigarette is still in her mouth, saying yes, and if he wanted her to tell him there had to be a condition, since she runs an underground clinic and she doesn't do charity, and she asks if he would accept. Lin Mo asks what the condition was because he would agree as long as he could do it. Then she holds his chin and says he has to be her research subject and allow only her to study him, reassuring him that her research wouldn't bring him any harm, since, as she had said, she was very interested in him. Lin Mo, with a smile, responds that the deal is done. Then the woman explains that there was a special substance in his blood, but she hadn't yet discovered what it was. What was certain was that it absorbed thermal radiation and converted thermal energy into usable energy for the entire body, but absorbing too much made his body cold. Simply put, his body suddenly had a way to store energy, so he was just hungry. Lin Mo asks if eating would be enough to recover. The doctor agrees, but the amount he needed to eat would be huge, and she didn't have that much food. The man tells her not to worry because he would figure it out. Then he heads towards his apartment through the emergency stairs. Thinking that it was good, he had prepared in advance and planned to go to the supermarket to buy some supplies, moving stealthily against DeLong's henchmen because as long as he got home safely, it would be a victory. Opening the door of apartment 409 and pressing the button on his key, he notices that everything inside was frozen. Lin Mo wonders if they cut off the heating in his room because that could freeze someone to death. But because of DeLong, his room had turned into an igloo, so he opens a box, saying it contained the highest calorie food. Inside were stacks of chocolate bars. He remembers Ming Ming and says he needs to change this brand the next time he buys chocolate. Then he bites into the bar with all his strength. However, there was no reaction, and it seemed like that amount wasn't enough, so he needed to increase the dose. So he does, eating chocolate non-stop and feeling the sensation, because it was as if something inside his body was creating heat, and it was a bad feeling like he was about to lose control. The henchman opened the apartment door, asking why it was unlocked, since the boss was planning to cut off the man's fingers to force it open, but today it just opened on its own, and there were tons of supplies inside. Lin Mo smirks while eating the last chocolate. The henchmen ready their weapons and ask who he was and how he opened the door. Joe in her lab reflects that the final simulation report was ready, and she should see exactly what was inside his body, noticing that the reversal process affected neural activity. Therefore, that was bad. If too much glycogen was replenished, he would become different. One of the henchmen yells that it didn't matter who he was because everything there belonged to them. But Lin Mo's previously bluish energy turns red as he enters a state of madness. 72 hours earlier, Joe went to the boiler room and asked what the hell had happened there to turn room 409 into this, noticing something strange forming on the floor and wanting to know what it was, but she collects it as a sample, saying it was interesting. However, a camera was pointed at the place. She says it looks like she'll have to go to the security room to find out the truth. From a recorder, a man starts an announcement. telling all residents to pay attention, because they should distribute supplies rationally to avoid waste. DeLong's henchman grabbed Joe by the arms, saying he was too heavy, but his friend reminds him not to forget what the boss said and to keep an eye on the boiler. DeLong continues, saying that all residents must pay a small compensation in exchange for heating, and a drunk man asks if this was some kind of joke from Joe, but his colleague replies that it didn't seem like the old man. Then the gangster explains so that everyone understands the seriousness of the situation, walking over to the heating switch, saying he would turn it off for a while to save some resources. With his lunatic expression, he shuts it down. Lin Mo suddenly wakes up, facing a man who asks if he hates. The boy was dressed like a prisoner and asks what he was supposed to hate. Then the figure asks if he hated DeLong, repeating the name Lu DeLong. Lin Mo replies that it was obvious he hated him, grabbing one of the henchmen by the neck while emanating his energy. The henchman is surrounded by a red aura. Then Lin Mo's eye turns the same color. He thinks that the henchman was Lu DeLong, saying that human flesh and beef tasted similar. Then he hurls the man far away, sending him out of the building and making him crash to the ground while burning in red energy. The people outside are shocked, seeing the completely charred body in front of the building, saying that he looked like he had fallen from the 4th floor. His friend asks what the hell just happened and who Lin Mo was, wondering if he was an alien as he approached him. He notices the energy and questions if it was a red aurora, quickly realizing there was no way to win against Lin Mo, and rushing at the man, planning to do whatever he could. But the hooded figure smiles, seeing the image of Lu DeLong in the henchman. He uses his speed to appear behind him, shocking the boy with his incredible speed. Lin Mo calls him to come at him, trying to provoke him, and so the henchman swings at him, but the man was no longer there. Trying to strike again, Lin Mo appears behind him, thinking of Lu DeLong, telling him not to move. Then the hooded figure prepares his hand, stretching it back as the henchman runs toward him, and then activating his power with his eye, dashing forward and slicing the man's body in half. Someone suddenly opens the door. Ming calls out to Lin Mo, shocking the boy with her presence. He looks at Ming, who was pointing a gun at him. Then shooting a dart toward his stomach, he asks why. Zhou says it was just insulin, making Lin Mo's aura dissipate, and as he falls into her arms, the doctor explains that it was to break down the excess heat in his body. But she looks ahead, astonished. Because all the plants had bloomed, she wanted to know what had happened there. Hunger is a catalyst for human atrocities, from eating each other to wars, which are things that repeatedly occur throughout human history. But as agricultural technology developed, human society gradually stabilized. However, hunger never left them, for in a frozen world, cultivation is an almost impossible task. History was about to repeat itself, but there is always an exception. So Lin Mo sleeps with his head resting on the plants. Zhou comments that he hadn't been awake for long and would have to sleep a little more, apologizing. But she wanted to know what all of this was. Picking up a tomato with her hands, she takes a bite of the tomato shortly after. The doctor tries to analyze the taste, saying that it wasn't bad at all, and the quantity was enough to feed the entire building. 2 people walk through the snow. The stomach of a girl growls, and she feels embarrassed by the sound. Her partner asks how she's feeling, and if she can hold on, but the girl simply says that it shouldn't be a problem. Then her friend touches his coat and says he just remembered a chocolate bar. She tries to be polite and refuses, but the man says that the bar was almost taken by DeLong, and he thought it was in this coat. His wife tells him to stop looking and asks if he doesn't remember, because they gave the chocolate bar to their daughter that morning. The husband turns to her, stunned. Then he laughs, saying he completely forgot, depreciating himself, saying he was useless, while a claw appears beside his head, destroying the man's face with a single strike. His wife stands in despair at what just happened. After all, they were facing a massive white armored creature that held her husband in its hand, then devouring the rest of the man's body. His blood splatters onto his wife's face, and the white armored creature says she looks delicious. The woman looks up and asks what that thing was, but someone blonde yells at her not to stand still, so she turns toward the voice and runs to escape the monster. The blonde shouts for the girl to come to him, and to run if she wants to live. The woman runs away from the white armored creature, but the monster tries to grab her with its hands, and the girl only glances back, tripping in the snow and tumbling away. She falls hard onto the ground, and tries to get up while the monster chases after her, crying as she pleads for her life. The blonde grabs a bottle of alcohol with a rag and ignites it with a lighter, throwing it toward the creature, which gets hit, triggering an explosion. Sparks of fire land on the woman, while the creature is engulfed in flames, screaming that it hates the heat, giving the wife a chance to escape. Facing the building, she thinks the monster might not have followed her. Seeing an elevator, maybe she could be saved, but the monster was still behind her, completely shocking the woman who desperately wanted to live. She cries again and repeatedly presses the elevator button, and the white armored creature keeps calling out to her. The girl screams at the damn elevator to hurry up, but the blonde appears, ordering her to close her eyes, completely surprising the woman who wasn't expecting it. Lights begin to flash, blinding the creature, which screams that it hates the brightness, and the blonde raises his hand, holding a pick between his fingers, getting ready to play a rock song. Then he strums his guitar to save the woman. Sound waves burst forward, and the creature screams that it hates rock as it writhes in agony. The woman's name was Dorothy Perez, and her childhood dream was to become a doctor. After growing up, she finally became one, a nurse, but she was unhappy with everything around her. But then she met Matt, who ate his food shyly beside her, and she too seemed excited to be by his side. After that, they got married. Then their daughter was born. Finally, they even moved to a new apartment. But it was something she knew very well. Whether the world suddenly froze over or criminals invaded the apartment, she feared what would come next after going through so much, wanting to understand what was happening now because that man with just a guitar managed to suppress that monster. And that was definitely the most ridiculous thing of all. The man finishes his song, raising his hand high into the air. Then the creature tries to grab him, saying that noise was irritating. But panting from his little performance, the man simply steps on a button on the floor, releasing metal rods from the ceiling, which shoot toward the creature, piercing it and catching it off guard, trapping the white armored monster among the wreckage. The monster's hand trembles in its final moments. Dorothy, astonished, asks if it's over, collapsing to the ground as she cries, saying that it was finally finished. But she looks ahead cautiously, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. The blonde extends his hand toward the girl, telling her that everything was fine now. Dorothy sits in front of a campfire, lost in thought. She looks at a picture of her family while her husband's face is covered in blood, and the man hands her a cloth, telling her to let her husband rest in peace, sitting beside her as he continues speaking. Because from dust to dust, from ashes to ashes, they needed to protect the living beyond mourning the ones who lost their lives. Dorothy looks at him with a strange expression. Then the man lights his cigarette and tells her not to worry, creating an awkward atmosphere between them. Dorothy introduces herself while the blonde stammers a bit, saying that she could call him Corbin. The woman thanks him while looking to the side, and Corbin accepts her gratitude. Dorothy asks if he was also going out to look for supplies. However, Corbin says that his situation was a little complicated, opening his guitar case and asking for a second to show her something, since he came from Seattle searching for a friend. But as soon as he arrived, he got trapped by the cold wave. Then he hands her a photo, saying that his friend was the one wearing the hat, and they used to play together in a band during high school. Dorothy immediately recognizes Lin Mo in the photo and says he was the guy who lived in apartment 409. Then a loud noise shakes both of them, and Corbin asks what was happening, because the entire city was trembling from the event. He asks what those things were, as a white armored monster stomps on the ground, while another has its neck slashed open, and a third has elongated arms. A whole army of pale-skinned creatures advancing. Dorothy notices the direction they were heading, since it was toward the apartment building. Lin Mo finally wakes up, wondering how he passed out, and in front of him is a woman's body. Startled, he tries to understand what is going on. Zhao finishes doing something behind him, and asks if he was awake already because she had put something on him, making Lin Mo question what was placed on him. But the young man was restrained in a chair, and the doctor tells him she installed a safety measure on him, revealing a collar around his neck. Collars are one of the oldest ornamental pieces, and their meaning has always changed. In the past, they were a symbol of slavery, representing control and ownership. But now they can also be a toy for adults. Zhao says Lin Mo shouldn't worry because the collar on his neck was definitely not for those purposes. So he asks about it, thinking that he wouldn't have thought that way if she hadn't said anything, telling her that he agreed to be her research subject, but not for this. The doctor says that the collar was a special monitoring tool, and that Lin Mo was a research subject, asking if he remembers the things inside his body, because they help him absorb heat and store it. However, it seemed to have another function, and this collar was made to prove that hypothesis, since when his blood sugar levels are high, it will activate another state, and the collar will change from blue to red. Lin Mo asks what she was talking about and what this other state was. Then the doctor questions if he remembers what happened 20 minutes ago. The young man is surprised by the question, noticing that he can't recall what had happened. Zhou tells him not to worry while placing her finger on his face, saying it's fine if he doesn't remember since she was there to figure out what was happening, because all of this was part of her research. Lin Mo thinks that he always felt like this woman had some control over him, but he really wanted to know what was going on, since once he found out, he would definitely gain some advantage over her. Zhou presses a button on her keyboard, injecting something into Lin Mo's bloodstream, which makes the young man glance to the side and see an IV drip, questioning what it was. He notices that it is glucose with a 25% concentration. The doctor turns, noticing the reaction it caused, and says that first she will record the data, while Lin Mo just wanted to know what was happening. Zhou smiles and says she almost forgot. She kneels in front of Lin Mo, and the young man asks what she was planning. Then the woman places a plant between his legs, completely surprising the man with the unexpected action. He quickly looks at the plant. His gaze starts to turn red along with the marks on his body. Then a red energy fills the room. He shouts that the doctor dared to deceive him, but his other self appears, saying that it was interesting. Stepping out from behind Joe and walking toward Lin Mo, he approaches the small branch of the plant, making it grow and then bear tomatoes. Then he asks if Lin Mo could see him now. The young man asks what was going on, and his other self says it was nice to meet again. Lin Mo questions if he was his other self, trying to tell the doctor that he was hallucinating, but his other self explains that the doctor couldn't hear him now. Lin tests it for himself, realizing there was no reaction when he spoke, so he asks if this was the work of that entity. The other self explains that, in a way, it was, but not entirely. Lin Mo grows irritated and asks what he meant by not entirely, and who he was, besides the fact that they looked the same. The being explains that they were both together, to be exact. After all, alone, he couldn't have reached this level. He pulls down his hood, saying that regarding his identity, that should reveal who he was. Lin Mo is shocked when he sees. After all, his other self's eyes were bluish, and he asks if Lin remembers. The young man says that he was the parasite from back in the cave, and the parasite confirms it, showing the mark on Lin Mo's back. He explains that his powers and the ability to resurrect were thanks to him. Transforming into a woman, she tells them both to get along. The National Security and Logistics Bureau was a branch of the agency, also known as ASLN, and was one of the few departments that could operate independently. The logistics agency had its own medical unit, administrative units with capable people, and even military units. This agency was considered the last safeguard of civilization in the world after the government collapse, and someone calls out to Xiao Luo, asking if the network had not yet been restored, while the woman had a photo of herself and Ju on her desk. Xiao Luo says that Miss Barbara had asked the same question 28 times in the last 2 days. Then Barbara sighs, looking at her partner. Xiao Luo begins to explain about the information department and a hardware issue, but Barbara shouts that she already understood. She has the surname Ripley and is a level 4 leader in biochemistry, saying that, to be honest, they were just passing responsibility around. Barbara asks if the report was complete, and Xiao Luo says it was almost ready. The woman says that was good enough and that it should be sent to her first, and her subordinate questions about the rest. With disdain in her voice, Barbara says that the bald guy wouldn't read it seriously anyway. Because the situation was urgent now, she opens a government document. She thinks that it was all starting again, and her bald boss complains that this was not the time to discuss such things. Frank Kordick, a level 2 minister, shouts that first, there were climate changes, then cyber attacks, rendering communication useless. And even the frontline operators had been out of contact for 48 hours, not to mention that their agents had not been properly activated. Therefore, they were in trouble and needed to act. He says that war never changes, and his soldiers. But he is interrupted by a kick from Barbara straight to his lower parts, saying that he shouldn't be worrying about political matters right now. In the sample observation room, she asks if he understands her urgency. Frank stares ahead, stunned, and Barbara explains that the white armored creature was found near the bunkers. The monster merely repeats that it was just a husk. Xiao Luo says that the creature was a mutated human. Frank questions this, but Barbara tells him to look at the monster's neck. The bald man starts to focus, noticing a collar on the creature, which he identifies as a member of the Field Operations Department. He wants to know what was going on there, and Barbara explains that it happened before the network went down. A signal from a missing agent was detected near the bunker, but when the department found his body, he was already lifeless, and his codename was Silver Hammer. She explains that 24 hours later, the body underwent a mutation and became what they were watching now. Xiao Luo adds that they had obtained some information from the CIA, and this creature was being monitored even before the Cold Wave and other related events. That footage was from the same supermarket, and those two were the first monsters, temporarily referred to as husks. An image of Lin Mo appears on the screen, and she says they had been calling him number 0. The young man wonders what was going on there, because just a second ago, the parasite was an insect, but now it had turned into a woman, whom he actually finds quite beautiful. The parasite smiles while looking at Lin Mo, saying that humans get shy when they see the opposite sex naked, then sitting on the young man's lap, making him wonder if it was an illusion, because the surroundings seemed as if time had frozen. The parasite says he could think of it that way. Lin Mo is startled, asking if she could hear what he was thinking. Then the parasite explains that yes, she could, because they were now fused, and Lin Mo complains that the explanation was weird. The woman says he could only see her because of Zhao's sugar, and Lin Mo realizes it was an illusion, then asks if the parasite had been activated. She twirls her hair in her hand and says that, strictly speaking, that was his blood. and that was the part that granted Lin Mo his abilities. The young man asks why she was parasitizing his body, and the woman says he was a curious creature, because she was different from humans and didn't belong to this dimension, making Lin Mo repeat that statement in disbelief. The parasite continues, saying that they needed to parasitize the bodies of natives to gain the ability to understand this dimension. The young man complains that it sounded like something out of a cheap romance novel. The parasite says her race has no name or definition, traveling between dimensions without perceiving time but unable to interfere, needing hosts to break barriers. However, she admits it must be hard for humans to understand, saying that they wanted to hear their own names and see the castles built over time, yet they couldn't interfere with the world, questioning how they could prove their own existence. Lin Mo asks if this was existentialist philosophy, because from what she was saying, she sounded quite lonely. The parasite is suddenly surprised, then bursts into laughter, asking if he was feeling sorry for her and if this was what humans called empathy. Then choosing humans as hosts seemed to have been the right answer. She embraces him, saying that his current expression was cute, but she had some bad news. Since the moment they fused, Lin Mo had become a target for the husks. The white armored creatures advanced toward the apartment, taking the form of wolves that gathered together. Their leader comments that the scent there was of food, but he also smells an enemy, ordering his group to move toward the building. The creatures crash into the structure. Lin Mo asks what the parasite meant by husks, and she responds that he would find out soon. However, if he needed anything, he could seek her out since he now knew how. Then the parasite claps her hands, and time resumes its normal flow. Meanwhile, a vial falls close to the ground. A severed head lands beside it. A girl runs away from a white armored creature, in a corridor filled with lifeless people due to the sudden attack. The building's residents run, rushing down the stairs, but a man is cornered by two monsters, banging on the door and shouting that it had locked itself at the worst possible moment. The white armored creatures finally reach him, piercing his body as they break through the door. Liu Delong's subordinates had been taking care of Officer Zhou, but they prepare to fight as the creatures invade, asking what the hell those things were. Zhou only watches as the two men are impaled by the monsters, wondering what those things were. Since they looked like the creature from before, he notices some red points on the monsters, questioning if they were sucking blood. However, the monsters hadn't noticed him yet, and he needed to find a way to escape. It would be difficult to break the rope without tools, and the pillar had no sharp edges, so he decides to resort to an old trick from his youth, gripping his thumb with the other hand and pushing it downward to dislocate it, freeing his hand from the rope with ease. Zhou says it was good to have those old injuries from his youth. Now his fingers tend to dislocate easily. He tries to move stealthily since the monsters don't seem to have noticed him. However, he realizes that in this situation, he couldn't leave empty-handed. Zhou thinks he needs to find the security vault, and luckily, the thieves hadn't realized it was a weapons cabinet. But then, a white armored creature appears in front of him. Zhou curses the whole situation out loud. Meanwhile, Zhou comments that, just as she suspected, the plants respond to his influence, capable of growing rapidly, and Lin Mo asks if she could undo everything. The doctor says that although he can do it, the boy cannot use the ability for long periods, or he would end up weakened. She has collected most of the data she needed, and Lin Mo yells at her to hurry up and help him undo it. A tremor shakes the room, and Zhou questions what that sound was. The door of the room begins to rattle. Frightened, the doctor asks what is happening. Lin Mo is surprised and asks if it could be a monster. One suddenly appears in the room. He notices that it is a white armor. The parasite whispers in his ear that it is the shell. Lin Mo turns around, asking why she is still there. But the creature puts a finger on his mouth, saying that this was not the time to be thinking about that, because if he doesn't act fast, Zhao will lose his life. Lin Mo activates his ability and rushes forward, questioning why all the women around him are so difficult. He picks Shu up in his arms while apologizing and asking for her permission. Then he flees far away using his powers. The creature attacks the wall since Zhao is no longer in front of it. Lin Mo lands on the ground, still holding the girl, and asks if she is okay. However, he notices the girl's embarrassed expression. She touches his chest and says it was fun to experience his ability like that. Lin Mo helps her up while they both face the monster. Zhou questions what it is, and her friend responds that he doesn't know, but it is definitely dangerous, calling for Dr. Zhu while stepping in front, because he wants to deal with that creature. Zhao reminds him that he shouldn't overuse his abilities, and the boy agrees, saying that he wants to tell her something, since although she is a bit clumsy, judging by the results, she really helped a lot, and he thanks Dr. Zhou. She is completely surprised by this, and questions why he is bringing this up now. Lin Mo prepares for battle and says they can deal with those small matters later, because he will make sure to properly thank her. Several white-skinned creatures appear in a room to face him. The boy is taken aback by this, wondering if it could be a collective action. Dealing with one was easy, but with so many, he might fall into a weakened state again. Zhou asks what's wrong since she was eager to see how he would thank her, and Lin replies that maybe she should wait a little longer. Then the monsters charge at him. Realizing he will have to face the white armored creatures head-on, he prepares a combat stance against them. Joe picks up the tablet and says that since this is the case, she should test his limits, monitoring his glycogen at 100%. Lin dodges a creature, thinking that if he keeps using acceleration continuously, he will end up weakened before finishing them. But he grabs one of the monsters, saying he has a way, because he only needs to use the power when necessary, throwing the creature towards its group. The creatures regroup to attack, and Lin thinks they are not as dumb as they seem. But he is no longer the monster's prey. Lin Mo activates acceleration in his eye, noticing that when the ability is activated, time slows down for him, allowing him to observe the beast's movements and predict their attack. Thus, he dodges the strikes, realizing that with this, he doesn't even need full-body acceleration. And the same applies to his attacks, advancing against the creatures again, even unarmed, as long as he accelerates his fists to a certain degree. He can trigger a supersonic explosion, destroying everything in the room. Lin Mo turns to the remaining beasts and asks if they are afraid now, since he is just getting started. Joe, analyzing the data, comments that although calorie consumption hasn't decreased, the efficiency of ability usage has been optimized, since in all this time he has consumed less than 10% of his energy. She finds this interesting with a smile on her face, calling Lin Mo a test subject, and telling him that he could unleash himself with that previous move. Lin complains that, as he suspected, she was monitoring his body condition. The beasts charge at the boy, who prepares his strike, shouting that the doctor is a fraud while unleashing a blast of power. Lin Mo takes a deep breath after the attack. The veins in his neck have already turned blue, and his arm is still consumed by energy, but his glucose consumption is still at 83%. The doctor approaches, saying he has mastered his abilities very well, and the boy just turns to look at the woman. She continues, saying she has a question, since he seems to know a lot about these things, ordering her test subject to tell her everything he knows while exhaling smoke from her cigarette. In the boiler room, the body of the white armored creature stretches out in blood. Joe was unconscious beneath the monster, but suddenly he opens his eyes. Looking around, he asks what is happening and notices the blood on the floor. He pulls the knife from the monster's belly. While trying to understand what just happened, he moves the monster aside. He remembers the fight he had against the creature, and that if he hadn't had the lever, he would have been finished. But he walks out of the room, thinking about what would happen if the monsters appear again, and he wasn't as lucky. A vibration comes from the phone in his pocket, making the man question whether the network was still down. But the call was from an unknown number. Joe puts the phone in his pocket, and the caller greets him with a "Good morning, Josh Castillo," asking if he should call him Mr. Curved Blade. Lin Mo explains everything he knows to Ju, while thinking that he wouldn't mention having lost his life once and traveled through time. The doctor changes her outfit and comments that she expected as much, but if he was done talking, he should help her with the zipper. The young man zips it up while she explains that it was a prototype environmental protection suit from her previous job, and Lin questions the sudden outfit change. Joe tells him to look at the ceiling. Since the white-skinned creatures had invaded the vents, they might have damaged the ventilation, and asks if Lin hadn't noticed the temperature drop. A noise is heard outside. Both go to the door. Finding Dorothy's daughter, Joe comments that it's just a child, and Lin says she's his neighbor. The little girl runs, and the young man chases after her while the doctor says she hates kids. Lin is surprised when he looks down the hallway, because the path is covered in blood and a little girl is pointing. Zoe notices several corpses on the floor and says they are residents of the building. While Lin wonders why all of them have gunshot wounds, he approaches the child, telling her it's dangerous around here. But the girl points to old Joe, who is lying on the ground. Lin thinks that he had already lost his life, and in his previous life, it had been Joe who took the initiative to share food, but he also lost to a white armored creature. So he touches the body's shoulder, saying that in the end, good people never get a happy ending. Suddenly, Joe grabs Lin's hand, which startles him, making him scream dramatically. The old man explains that he hadn't passed on yet but still owed Lin one. The little girl grabs Joe's hand, asking if she is a doctor, because her mother said that doctors wear clothes with red crosses, and she had one on the back of her hand, asking if she could help Uncle Joe. Joe looks at the child without reacting, but then she steps closer, saying she will make an exception and won't charge anything. She kneels beside Joe and asks what happened to leave him in this state, but Joe says it's a long story, since after leaving the boiler room, his plan was to get to the security room, but the first floor was full of monsters. He ended up climbing the emergency stairs and found several survivors along the way, and since the monsters were coming, his only option was to keep going up. But that's when something happened. Lu DeLong appeared with a firearm, shooting survivors in the head as they climbed the stairs, leaving the bodies for the white armored creatures to devour. Joe asked what the man was doing, but DeLong commented that he was simply using the weak to buy himself time, shooting at the other survivors along the way. While aiming at the girl, He said that the strong had always been above the weak because it was a rule established by God, firing his weapon again, hitting Joe, who stepped in front of the shot. After that, DeLong kept going up, while Joe lay there bleeding until he lost consciousness. Zhao says that fortunately, the bullet didn't hit a vital point, but he lost a lot of blood and needed to get to a safe place. Lin Mo repeats the name Lu DeLong with rage, stepping forward as Joe asks what he plans to do. The young man looks back while activating his abilities. DeLong shoots at other people along the way who scream for him to wait, saying they are human. But the man contradicts them, saying they are just weak meat, and that having bodies everywhere was good since it was enough to slow the monsters down. Because although that place was an old warehouse, it should be the safest spot in the building. He opens a door, hoping to find supplies inside. But he notices a dark presence coming from the hallway. Lin Mo pulls down his hood, saying that he is facing the man once again, calling out to Lu DeLong with anger. The gangster fires at the young man, asking if he wasn't supposed to be in hell, but Lin dodges all the shots while charging toward DeLong, landing a kick that severs his leg, then lunging forward with his hand shaped like a claw, slicing off the arm holding the gun, and grabbing DeLong's head with his hand. The man asks why he is doing this while Lin heads toward the balcony. Since he hadn't even done anything to him yet, Lin Mo questions how he could say he hadn't done anything, but then he realizes that nothing from his previous life has happened yet. But after coming back, he never sought revenge, as he only wanted to create a safe place for himself. However, looking at the situation now, that had been foolish as innocent people lost their lives. And all of this made him furious, but it was clear that his anger wasn't just toward DeLong, because he also felt anger toward himself for being such an idiot, burning DeLong's body with his power, and hurling it toward the white-skinned creatures while declaring that now, if he were to do it again, he would do the same to his enemy 100 times over. Because that was the law of the frozen world. Joe and the little girl warmed themselves by a fire. Zhao comments that the building manager used this place as a storage room, so it could be useful to them since there were still some supplies left. Lin Mo sits in the corner near a crate, thinking that he finally got his revenge, but it didn't feel like it was enough. The doctor interrupts him by smacking his head, asking what he is thinking, since she already suspected he had issues with that bastard, and it was normal for people to become compulsive when they had great power, but in Lin's case, it was different. Thanking him for getting rid of DeLong, Lin asks if she also had problems with the gangster, and the woman recalls moments from her past with him pointing a gun at people. The young man stands up and says the doctor doesn't have to answer if she doesn't want to, since they would be staying there for now, and because it was used as storage, the heater didn't work, and seeing how the place was, everything still seemed intact. But old Joe was injured, and Maggie was just a child, so they wouldn't be able to rely on the fire in the barrel forever. With dangerous white-skinned creatures outside, they needed to reinforce the room's security, and they could use the available materials for that. However, if they wanted real warmth, they needed to go to the power room. Joe comments that the building is full of monsters and fears what could happen if they don't do something about it. Maggie suddenly sneezes while they are talking. Lin says she could end up with hypothermia if she stays still like that, and Joe explains that there is only one way. Inside a garbage tunnel, footsteps are heard. Mo suddenly falls out, landing face first on the ground, grumbling about it being the garbage tunnel of all places. But he is surprised when he looks ahead. Seeing a creature that looks like a core, he wonders if the white-skinned beings have fused with the residents, forming a nest. He turns around, noticing a strange noise, wondering if it could be a white armored creature, but Joe suddenly falls on top of him. On the ground, Lin comments that the doctor is stopping him from getting up. The doctor retorts that she can move if he takes his hand off her. A sudden noise is heard, and she signals for Lin to stay silent. Then the creature looks to the side, passing by them unnoticed. Zhao asks what that thing was, and Lin wants to know why she even came there. She explains that 2 people are needed to operate the power room, and since Lin's body is in a weakened state, he might pass out there. The monster then suddenly charges toward the wall where they are hiding. The young man wonders what kind of monster that is, as it is different from the other white armored creatures, and he is too weak to fight it now. He could end up dead. According to the doctor, the white armored creatures don't eat people. They only drain and store their blood. But he wonders where all that blood is going. Maggie looks out the window and asks Joe what is happening, shocking the old man with the terrifying sight, since the white armored creatures are spreading across the building, and a female is lying on the ground with an immense belly. Corbin comments that she looks lifeless, and Dorothy says she won't attack them anymore. However, a light appears from the building, and a man is identified as Morse code. Dorothy asks about Morse, and Corbin explains that it is a signal language, allowing communication through different letters of the alphabet and numbers depending on the pattern used. Joe from the window signals with the light, saying that they should understand and not go there. Corbin is surprised by the code, and Dorothy questions what they are trying to say. The young man understands little but tells the woman that they are asking them to go there. Both move toward the building, while Dorothy appears hesitant and Corbin says that her daughter should be there, but Joe does not want the two of them to take that path. Still in the nest, Lin thinks they need to follow that route, but a white armored creature is blocking the entrance. He has no choice but to fight the monster. Cracking sounds come from the ceiling, drawing the creature's attention. Lin and Ju take the opportunity to move forward, thinking that this was a perfect distraction. The doctor comments that the veins on the floor seem connected to those who lost their lives. Lin agrees and says it's bizarre to use humans as part of a nest when suddenly something emerges behind him. It is a white armored creature with a skeletal structure. It takes on a humanoid form, resembling a lich. The creature shoves its hand into its own belly, pulling out intestines and using them to forge a sword, then swings the weapon downward. Lin senses something strange and curses the monster. He pushes Lin aside while accelerating his step. The creature charges to strike both of them, while the young man tries to reach Joe, getting slashed on his back to shield his friend from the attack. He steps back, holding onto the woman, saying that the monster is much faster than he is. Because that white armored creature is far stronger than the others, Lin places his hand on his own shoulder. Thinking about how powerful that white armored creature is, the monster suddenly makes a sound, its vision entirely focused on Ju. Lin Mo wonders why its target is the doctor and not him, but the creature lunges forward with its sword. The young man manages to push Joe aside, but gets slashed by the swords. That monster is too fast, making it difficult for Lin to hold out, because if the creature keeps attacking like this, both he and the doctor might lose their lives here. He wonders if he is about to die again. The parasite appears, talking about running away, asking if that isn't what people of his kind do in situations like this, because as he knows, in this frozen world, there is no mercy. It is a world where everyone is equal. So if he abandons the doctor, he might still survive. Lin says that he won't run away, because if he does that now, there would be no difference between him and Lu Delon, saying that he does not need to abandon his humanity to survive. Surprising the parasite with his response, Lin explains that if she is part of him, she should understand. When innocent people lose their lives, his chest aches and he feels suffocated. That pain is his humanity suffering, just like the fossils of his ancestors, which bear fractures proving that they did not abandon their companions. Therefore, Lin can only think of one thing now. Since he has this power, he will make sure to use it to his advantage, forming veins across his body and horns. The symbol on his necklace begins to be consumed by the veins. As the white armored creature charges toward Ju with its sword, the doctor is frightened and starts sweating, but the creature's attack is blocked. A bluish white armored creature stands before her, and Ju asks what it is. Lin is that monster and declares that with this power, he will protect people. He notices that he looks similar to that white armored creature, but he clenches his fist as he does not feel the same as it. The young man releases energy into his hand, and his monstrous body takes on a blue glow. The parasite comments that this is interesting because it seems she made the right choice in selecting him, and the young man will now feel the essence of power. Lin then charges to punch the creature, landing a blow that the monster defends against. He advances again, attempting a horizontal kick, but the monster dodges. Lin has become faster, but it is still not enough as the monster continues to evade. Joe questions what is happening because he has created a new layer on his skin, as if he is absorbing energy from the air and converting it into power. But given the place they are in, she wonders if this is an unlimited energy source and what the essence of this power is. Lin thinks that for now he will put aside his resemblance to the white armored creatures as the monster strikes at him. Even with this power, it is difficult for Lin to defend himself and fight the creature, dodging the monster's attack by a hair's breadth, landing a grazing punch on the creature. They collide and Lin thinks that he can accelerate time, wondering if he could do the opposite. The creature charges with a diagonal strike and then flees from Lin, heading straight toward Dr. Zhu without hesitation. Lin concentrates his energy into his fist, striking the creature's nest. The monster, which was just about to attack the woman, stops in time, only a centimeter away from hitting her. Lin thinks that it worked, but he prepares to run, saying that this is it, because he will finish the monster with a single strike, slashing multiple times across the creature's back, calling this attack Shadow Fist. Time returns to normal, and an explosion occurs. Zhao falls to the ground, covered in the creature's blood, while Lin extends his hand and says they need to leave as they can't stay there. With the temperature reaching 26 degrees Celsius, Joe comments that they did it, while Maggie cheers because it's warm, and says she wants to see her mother. A noise is heard in the cell, and Joe asks what it is, wondering if it could be a white armored creature. Lin opens the door, informing old Joe that he's back. The old man greets him, saying that they finally returned. But the young man asks what happened to him, while Joe tells him not to get agitated, because if the wound opens again, she will have to stitch it up. Joe says that a while ago, he heard a noise in the ducts, and it could be a white armored creature. Lin looks at the ducts, wondering about the noise, saying that it could just be the old pipes settling. He tells old Joe not to worry, as it's probably just an illusion, and the white-skinned creatures were concentrated on the lower floors. However, the duct suddenly collapses. A strange figure falls in front of them. Joe raises his crowbar, saying that he was right, while Lynn activates his power and asks if they had turned into a blood nest. But Maggie calls out for her mother. Dorothy responds to her daughter, asking what she is doing there, while Corbin complains that it's the heating duct and it's way too hot. Maggie explains that a white armored creature invaded their home, and a blonde uncle shot many uncles and aunts, but Uncle Joe saved her, though he got injured, and the dark-haired uncle saved him. Corbin calls Lin Mo a smelly brat, surprising the young man that someone knows him. The blonde man rushes toward him, saying that he missed him a lot. Lin tries to recognize who he is while stepping back, but Corbin hugs him, saying that he walked all the way from Aberdeen and crossed the entire continent. The young man immediately activates his ability, punching Corbin in the face and asking how he dares. He wonders why Corbin feels so familiar, while the blonde asks how he could do that. After all, not even his father hit him. Lin wonders if this person is also from this timeline, like the doctor, and seems to know him, but he never had any friends in Aberdeen. Corbin clings to Lin's arm, saying that he is going to form a new band, and Mo will be Slash's right hand while he will be Hendrix's left hand, as Maggie asks if the two of them are friends. Lin is shocked because he just wants to know who this blonde man is, noting that the differences in this timeline compared to before could be explained by the butterfly effect. After all, the future had been altered, but there was no explanation for Corbin. Saying that he could only ask the parasite, he enters his mental world and states that he has some questions for her. But receiving no answer, he reflects that she always appeared on her own, but when he looks for her, she doesn't respond, saying that the parasite is really selfish. Zhao interrupts them, saying that this is no time for reminiscing about the past, but Lin retorts, saying that he doesn't even know him, and Corbin complains that he came all this way just to have fun at his expense. However, the doctor asks about the current situation, because even though they solved the heating problem, there is now a much more serious one, as those white armored creatures seem to be the offspring of that mother, and these nests are sending blood to her. Soon, this building will be assimilated. If they keep ignoring this, once the blood nests take over, Lin finishes her sentence, saying they'll have to face the white armored creature with the intestine sword, saying that if that's the case with his power, he could take it on, but Zhu tells him that it's not that simple, since the indicator light is constantly blue, and after using Hai Sha, it shines even brighter. Lin wonders if Hai Sha is that black form and if it also consumes a lot of heat. Zhao confirms that activating this state consumes a great amount of heat, and right now, there isn't enough. But he is the only one capable of fighting the white armored creatures, and the situation is dire. Mo reflects that if he wanted to survive and continue protecting, he needed warmth. Then he says he had an idea. He asks the doctor if there were any spare planks, and Zhou says they were there but wants to know why. Lin takes the sword from Zhou's hand and asks him to lend the sacred sword of physics, because it didn't matter whether it was the blood nests outside or the threat of the mutant white armored ones. The core of the problem or the main conflict was just one. He uses his power to advance and gather materials, as hunger was the best seasoning for those who lacked strength to work, and eating gave strength. Zhou says he understands. It was a hydroponic system. Lin's reasoning was truly unique, and Zhu asks if he was going to cultivate there. But the young man replies that it was about the value of honest workers and an innate ability, since more and more people were joining, solving the food problem was a priority, reflecting that they knew what hungry people were capable of doing. Zhao blows smoke in Lin's face and asks what the next step was, because the hydroponic system wouldn't produce food out of nowhere. The young man clenches his fists, ready to begin. As he walks through the building, he notices that, as expected, the bodies had disappeared and there were no traces of blood, reflecting that something was collecting the bodies, and it could be that big guy from before. This meant he had little time, and the blood nests would soon reach that floor, so he needed to act fast. Lin wanted to use the black form to eliminate the source completely, but before that, he needed to solve the problem of warmth and food. Corbin interrupts him, calling him Haigu, and asking where he was sneaking off to alone. Lin questions how he followed him, but the blonde replies that everyone understands, and Lin didn't pay attention because he thought having a bad friend like him was embarrassing. However, he understood his friend, and now that he worked at a big company, a beggar like him wasn't well regarded, and Lin wanted to know what that had to do with this guy. Corbin continues, saying that now they were alone, he could speak freely, but the young man just finds him annoying. The blonde places a hand on his shoulder and asks why his brother wouldn't speak, but Lin simply replies that they were screwed, standing face to face with the big guy in the blood nest room. Under a bridge, Corbin calls Jerry, since they were quite similar, because they had both been expelled and could only hide under the bridge. From now on, he and the rat would depend on each other, but if he didn't want to, he didn't have to leave. Besides, it was raining and Lin appears, calling him. He says he knew where his friend was, because whenever he got kicked out of somewhere, he hid there, asking how many times his father had beaten him. While Corbin asks if he came just to provoke him, Lin questions how he could do that. However, even if they were running away, they couldn't just hide under an old bridge, and if they were going to flee, they should do it with style. Corbin asks where he learned those cliché lines, but Lin extends his hand and calls Corbin, because if they were going to run away, it should be with a good friend to make it stylish. Corbin says he would only go along so Lin would stop running away from these things, and Lin thanked him. In the present, the young man grabs the blonde by the neck, asking what he was thinking, shouting that they should run while holding his friend. Corbin complains that this escape was not stylish at all. At a distance, Lin says the nests seemed to have spread to the 4th floor, and they needed to go back to get the seeds. Corbin complains that they should be fleeing in style, and his friend responds, wanting to know why he was saying that in a situation like this. The blonde asks if it wasn't him who had said that, and Lin says he never did. The two argue because Corbin thinks Lin is pretending, and the young man denies it. But the discussion is interrupted when an impact breaks the wall. The creature's hand pierces through the structure. Lin dodges, thinking that it was already too late, while Corbin is shocked by the creature breaking through the wall, holding Lin's head, which was close to being crushed. The blonde prepares his Molotov with a bottle, catching the creature's attention, and throwing the Molotov, shouting for the creature to release his brother. The monster tries to defend against the fire with its hand, throwing Lin away while trying to put out the flames. The young man crashes into the blood nest. He notices that the veins were sticking to him because he was being absorbed by the blood nest, trying to escape. His face becomes covered in veins, and even his hand was being consumed, while Lin curses the situation, thinking that everything would end like this. He opens his eyes with his smaller hand. Lin wonders what is happening, wanting to know where he is, but he notices something strange when looking at the roots. Seeing that there is a white armored humanoid figure trapped, Lin questions whether it is still alive, and the creature opens its eyes, looking in the young man's direction and startling him. The environment shifts, and Lin touches his foot to the ground, wanting to know what is happening and where he is now. His vision shows his childhood self holding Corbin's hand. He says that was the nosy blonde from Aberdeen and questions who he was talking to. Noticing that it was him, Lin wonders if they were really friends and if this was his memory. But his childhood version shouts that it wasn't, because he wasn't the blonde one, he was Kurt Cobain's friend, not Lin's, calling him a thief. Lin opens his eyes, almost entirely consumed by the veins. Kurt pulls his hand, saying that dying like this would be pathetic. He manages to pull Mo out of the veins and asks if he is okay, while the young man reflects that he almost became food for a blood nest, wondering what had just happened. However, he quickly decides to let it go, as this was no time to think about it, wanting to know what they were going to do about that giant, as it didn't seem afraid of fire. Kurt grabs another Molotov and says that guy was pretty tough, so he would offer him another drink. Lin interrupts him, telling him not to rush. The fat of the white armored ones burns quickly at high temperatures, but the monster absorbed heat and had high regeneration, and Kurt realizes that Lin analyzed everything calmly, something rare, throwing the Molotov with the intention of burning it until it can't regenerate, and Lin asks if he didn't hear him, because this time, the monster doesn't even bother defending against the burst of fire. Lin decides to use the black form, as he can't leave that thing there, but nothing happens despite his attempt. He remembers what the doctor said, that he doesn't have enough energy now to use the black form, meaning he can't fight this thing. However, Lin is suddenly struck by a thought. From the beginning, it seems somewhat familiar, the monster absorbing heat, and the doctor mentioned that his high Shan state did the same, so he gets an idea. At that moment, the creature slams the ground, sending the monster flying. In his past life, the fortress had been attacked again, and in front of a cross, they hoped for a spirit to find peace. Lin Mo notices they had been losing people for a month. They had already changed locations countless times to avoid the white armored ones, but they always found them, and no matter how much they tried to escape, they still had to keep running. He tells old Joe that he's had enough, surprising the old man. After all, Lin Mo didn't want to run anymore. Back in the fight, he realizes he had been right, because he could absorb energy from the environment, and so the heat from the flames was also absorbed and converted into energy. Kurt questions why Lin has horns now as the young man transforms. His high chef form starts to take shape, and his fist turns completely black, landing a full force punch on the giant monster. Kurt shields himself from the wind and wants to know what's happening, because with a single punch, his friend sent the monster flying. Lin calls Kurt Corbin and tells him to listen, because whatever he thought he knew about him before, it had nothing to do with now. He was no longer the same. Corbin is surprised and says his friend looks amazing in that outfit, asking where he got it. The blonde had already come to terms with the fact that he couldn't call his friend a monster, but Lin denies it, Soon, he changes the subject, saying that the big guy would be tough to deal with, asking how many Molotovs Kurt still had, and Kurt says he would check, opening his guitar case and showing that there were still plenty left. However, the monster regains consciousness thanks to the punch and stands facing the two of them. Corbin asks what they are going to do, and if they are going to run. Lin wonders if he should flee. Having visions of what happened in his past, the young man becomes more determined, deciding that he won't run, because running away would make things boring. Corbin looks at his friend, thinking that he has really changed. Calling him by the nickname Little Black, Lin reflects that the monster wouldn't be so easily defeated because, even though it had regenerative abilities, it was still very slow. Stepping on the monster's head, the young man prepares his fist to punch, causing multiple holes in the creature's body. Lin jumps back to retreat for a second, saying that now it was Kurt's turn. He throws all the Molotovs that were in the guitar case, causing a massive explosion against the monster. The creature's fat was flammable, so as long as the wound was deep enough, the fire would burn the fat, but it wouldn't take long for it to regenerate. Thus, Lin brings his hands together to attack while it burns, because he would absorb the heat from the burned fat of the white armor, and use the flesh and blood of his enemy for his own benefit. His monstrous form grows wings on his back, and his energy emanates more powerfully. He stomps on the ground with force, advancing rapidly, destroying everything in his path with his explosion of energy. Lin uses his foot to stop the impact, pointing his finger at the creature, and then, getting close to it, he places his finger on its nose. The kinetic energy causes the entire structure of the creature to be destroyed with a mere touch. Corbin watches from afar and asks if that was a sound barrier, while Lin reflects that as long as the entire body is destroyed, even the strongest regenerative ability is useless. However, he only managed thanks to Kurt, and although he seems suspicious, he was truly helpful. He helps his friend up, asking if he is okay, while thinking that he looked sloppy but wasn't an idiot, and Kurt questions why he is being so polite, asking if they were going downstairs to do that again, making Lin think he was an idiot. Corbin yells when they enter the apartment. In room 409, he says he finally understands, because they were there to get seeds in the nutrient solution, questioning when his friend learned about agriculture and how he got all these things, wanting to know also when he got his powers, but Lin mentally complains about finding an idiot even after being reborn. On Lin's necklace, a voice is heard trying to communicate. The young man is surprised while Corbin asks where he got such a cool necklace. Mo tells him to shut up and places his fingers on his nose. Corbin yells that he is hurting him and that he is bleeding, and Ju asks what the two are doing. Lin asks if the necklace was for communication and also explains that he only managed to reach the room. The doctor announces that she has good news, because they found some old things in the warehouse, like this old radio station. They also found gardening supplies, which the housewife probably used for planting flowers. Lin asks if that was the good news, and the doctor continues talking, because she had a personal request. At the doctor's house, Lin reflects that he couldn't believe he had returned to this place. Corbin comments that even that trashy building had a lab, and his friend says it was a clinic, but he was right as they search for the capsule the doctor wants. Seeing a giant flask and asking what it is for, because it seemed real and what Kurt said might be true, the doctor might not actually be a doctor. He sees a biohazard warning and wonders if the doctor was studying the white armor. Wanting to know who the hell the doctor really was, Corbin turns on the computer and Lin asks what he is doing, hitting his friend on the head and telling him not to mess with other people's computers, asking what if he deleted the doctor's important information, but Kurt says he wasn't an idiot. Lin has a sudden realization and thinks about the information, telling Kurt to leave and calling him a lackey, which enrages his friend. Lin tells him to go and gather useful supplies, but Corbin tells him not to kick his guitar. He sits at the computer because he might find something important. Lin finally finds information on the computer, seeing a photo of her younger self and noting that she was Shire, also noticing the ID on her neck. The young man understands that the doctor was hiding things from him. The base door opens. Joe greets Lin for returning, asking how it went, and Corbin explains that everything went well while Ju listens to the conversation, distant, watching the people. Lin explains that he managed to collect some seeds that were in the room due to the limited number of accessible floors, and unfortunately, he didn't find anything to eat directly, while Joe says it wasn't his fault but Lou DeLong's for stealing the supplies. Then he asks for help planting, but Lin refuses since old Joe was injured. Joe offers to help since she knew a bit about botany and biochemistry and could be useful, asking if Lin didn't think so. The young man agrees, looking suspiciously at the doctor, but Kurt interrupts them, saying that he would help too, then changes his mind upon seeing their looks. Lin tells him to go to the kids' table with Maggie since he wasn't helping. Separated from the others, Joe asks about what she had requested earlier. Lin shows the flask and asks if this is what she was referring to. But when the woman reaches for it, he steps back and tells her to wait, wanting to know if she wasn't going to explain anything before taking it, because he needed to find out who the hell she really was. With a smile on her face, Joe asks if he still hadn't figured it out. Lin notices the expression on her face and questions if the doctor did it on purpose. Zhao remains silent, keeping her smile. The young man wonders if the capsule was just bait to lure him to her house, wanting to know what the former biochemical department agent, Zhou Shuya, was planning. Zhou grabs the flask and says he got half of it right, because it wasn't bait, but rather the key to humanity's survival. She asks if he remembers when he became Hai Shan, as he looks similar to the monsters, and she believes there is a connection between him and the creatures. The organ reinforces this theory. Even in that state, it was still absorbing heat, much like what happened to Lin. The young man asks what this has to do with the key to survival and why she revealed her identity. Zhou tells her test subject not to worry, because whether for food or for storing energy to face the mother outside, they needed to solve the planting problem quickly. And if she isn't mistaken, when he created the hydroponic tank, he was thinking about using the red limit state to accelerate plant growth. In other words, the key to everything was Lin entering the red limit, but he didn't have enough energy to fight, let alone reach that state. Even if he could absorb heat from the surroundings, he still wouldn't be able to, because his storage organs weren't efficient enough yet to allow it. So if she could add this organ, they could have a more efficient absorption system that would enable Lin Mo to enter the red limit. Lin stops, intending to think for a moment, but Zhu presses the flask against his abdomen, summarizing that to survive, he needs to insert that into himself. The young man asks if there wouldn't be any rejection reaction, but black veins begin to spread over the flask. Zhou asks what that is. Then the veins form a face and an immense force. Lin Mo also doesn't know what is happening, wondering if the Black Fury wants a piece of the white armor's flesh. The flask shatters on the ground, and Zhu analyzes that the young man's body couldn't wait any longer. Thus he enters the red limit state, collapsing to the ground as a creature emerges from his back. The doctor wonders if his power source came from a parasite, wanting to know how he could fit such a massive entity inside his body. Lin simply smiles in the red limit state. It was time to plant. He says the seedlings mature naturally, and the shells were sterilized, free of green algae, with only a few things missing. But he hears a noise from the top of the shelf. Maddie touches a plant and asks what it is because it's so small. Lin says it's a lettuce seedling, and the little girl asks about seedlings. So the young man explains that it's a baby lettuce, just like little Maggie. The girl disagrees, saying that's not true because she is taller. And then she asks what lettuce even is. Dorothy appears and says it's the green vegetable in her favorite burger. So Maggie asks if her mom can take her to eat a burger when her dad comes back. Dorothy tries to talk about her father, but Kurt comes up behind Lin and bluntly tells her that her father is gone, leaving the young man speechless. But he quickly interrupts Dorothy's train of thought and turns to Corbin, asking if he brought the wheat seeds to make bread. Corbin responds that he did, and Lin follows up, asking about tomato and cucumber seeds to make a burger. Then they ask little Maggie if she would like a burger, because they would eat as soon as the little lettuce became big. Maggie asks how long that would take. Lin explains that if they were in ancient Greece, he would be the god of agriculture, and with him, plants would grow super fast. Then Maggie shouts that this is great. Dorothy thanks the guys, and Lin introduces himself as the guy from apartment 409. The woman says that they are trapped in this situation, and if they could at least make plants grow faster, they wouldn't suffer from cold or hunger. Kurt says his friend is super talented and wasn't joking, but Lin interrupts him before he can mention his powers, dragging him away and asking him not to say anything because the fewer people who know, the better, and Kurt asks why. Lin tells him not to ask, remembering Zhao mentioning that she worked on a fire in the field project during her time in the Secret Service. The security level of the program was high, and the departments involved were confidential, even among themselves, but she managed to obtain specific information. A project to infiltrate agents among civilians using drugs, brainwashing, and hypnosis, creating human monitors while the NSB protected the country. She didn't know if the NSB was paralyzed or not, or if there were NSB monitors among them. But if they found out about him, nothing good would happen, and the fewer people who knew, the better. Lin agrees, saying he had a solution while hitting Kurt on the head. Corbin walks away with Dorothy, saying she didn't need to worry since Lin was the god of agriculture. The young man looks around, searching for someone, but then he notices he was alone. He points his arm at the plants, deciding he would begin, focusing intensely with his eyes closed, then activating the red limit. But he was being filmed by a camera, and it was being broadcast. A satellite beeps, and communication asks if it has been restored, restarting the system and connecting the satellite to search for whatever they could find in the sky. People ask what is happening because the area was frozen and they would need to gather ground information to locate terrestrial equipment, activating the only 3 drones available. However, since it was cold, the batteries wouldn't last long, so they needed to collect as much information as possible before losing them. An employee asks what his superior was looking for, and he responds that he was searching for anything useful. She tells the boys to stay low because, with luck, they might find a sign of survivors or a rescue team. One of them responds that there was nothing interesting on his side, noticing the vane on the building and telling them to wait. As he gets closer, the vanes take over the transmission, but the drone is immediately destroyed. The mother raises her bleeding hand, and the drones question what that was and start recording. But the creature begins pulling the vanes from around it. A limb emerges from within the structure. The entire building shakes, including Lin's room. He wonders if it was an earthquake. He approaches Zhu and asks what is happening, but the doctor tells him to look outside, because it seemed like they were running out of time. As a giant-eyed creature appears, staring through the window, Zhao explains that this was what the mother had given birth to, the child. The being simply asks where it is, unintentionally activating Lin's ability, wanting to know where its head was, extending its arm to use its ability. Kurt approaches the two and asks what was going on. The energy in the creature's hand starts generating lightning. Then Lin shouts for everyone to get down. The monster blows up a large part of the building with its ability. Lin closes his eyes to try to shield himself from the power, opening them again to look to the side. He holds Zhao, thinking that was close, asking if the doctor was okay. She says yes and asks about the test subject, because they were very close and she notices his heart was beating fast. Lin suddenly pulls away and says it's good she's okay. But it wasn't time to relax, as the creature was staring directly at them. Lin wonders why those fragments were suspended in the air, questioning if it was electricity or magnetism. But soon, the child uses its ability again, firing the electrified stones forward, causing another explosion in the building area. Dorothy dodges while holding Maggie. Kurt asks what the hell is going on. Thinking the whole situation sucks, he shouts, asking if Lin is okay, but finds only the completely destroyed structure. Kurt curses, but then he hears a voice from below, telling him not to be scared. It was the doctor, who had gotten stuck on a pillar and was asking for a hand. Kurt helps her up and asks where Lin is, and the doctor tries to say where they were. However, they are interrupted by the creature attacking. Dorothy screams for everyone to run as Corbin asks what the hell that thing was. But the creature is suddenly slashed by a red energy. Zhao identifies the color of the attack, and then the creature falls backward, crashing into a building. Lin stands in front of it in his white armor mode, but now with red stripes instead of blue. A camera records the wreckage. The person watching asks if this was the monster the rescue team had mentioned, the one lifting stones with its power, breaking the drone, which was the last one remaining. The people watching ask what they should do now. Pops explains that it hasn't been long since communications were re-established, so it will take a while for the bunker to make contact. A woman says the bunker just needed to wait because those in the field had a lot to think about, and his colleague asks why he doesn't prepare for exploration, since they might find survivors. Pops refuses as the situation outside was uncertain, and it was better to wait and see what might happen. Another explosion occurs at the site of the battle. Lin emerges from the smoke, his body outlined by a different armor, and even creating more energy horns. He reflects that this was beyond the red limit and seemed like something else, like rekindled embers, so he clenches his fist. The child throws more stones toward the young man, but he takes a deep breath in his monstrous body, sitting on the ground to advance, and quickly rising from the ground, heading toward the stones that were thrown at him. Lin leaps over each of the stones, sending them back. The creature keeps trying to control them, while the young man thinks that embers did not burn intensely and were instead burning silently, like eternal sparks. The monster raises its hand and begins gathering several stones to launch at the boy, as if forming the structure of a meteor, and fires its ability at Lin. The attack approaches and the young man reflects that the sparks were not dying out. He channels energy into his fist to continue his thought. Because all of this was like the prelude to a wildfire on a plane, Lin strikes the meteor with his fist, causing a shockwave that spreads across the entire block. A building explodes from the flying stone fragments, striking all the houses around, and even hitting the creature itself. Dorothy questions what that red thing was, and Kurt was about to explain, but Zhu tells him to keep it a secret. Joe asks if it was an angel, surprising the three of them, because he defeated the creature and seemed like an angel sent by God, but his terrible face looked more like a demon. Lin falls to the ground, now with wings forming at his waist. He reflects that this time, he had gone too far, causing immense destruction to the building. The parasite asks if it wasn't fine, since he was the only one who could handle this kind of power. Lin asks if she was willing to leave and calls her an insect. The parasite is surprised and asks if he had something to tell her. The young man says he had many things. She raises her arms and says that thanks to the crazy doctor who fed him the core, she was in a good mood. So if Lin wanted to ask something, he should do it now. Lin asks what exactly white armor was and was about to ask another question, but the parasite places her finger on his mouth, saying they would do this little by little. She explains that white armor would be more accurately described as an empty shell, like a body without a soul, entirely bound by the obsession of its past life, just like Lin was bound, or rather Mo, who lost his life in the other timeline. Since time was not continuous for the parasite, Lin could die, and she would leave that timeline and move to another one. In this process, the soul and consciousness would go with her, leaving Lin's body behind, because the version of him that lost his soul would turn into an empty shell, and perhaps his shell was fighting somewhere out there. Lin reflects that all the places where conflicts arose in his memory now made sense, and the parasite tells him he understood quickly. The young man realizes that technically he had not been reincarnating but rather traveling through time. The child begins to shed its skin, because there was a core inside it, and a flame appears on its head. Lin realizes that each white armor corresponded to supernatural beings who had traveled through time. Xiaoblue asks Barbara what they were looking for, and the woman replies that if the guy from the field who turned into a monster brought a delivery, then they needed to see what it was, but her subordinate objects, saying it was the highest level of evidence and that their boss would be angry. But soon, they realize that the package was a head. The child calls for its head, asking where it might be, and creating a blast of energy thanks to the fire on its head. Lin defends himself from the energy using his arms, asking what was going on, and if that creature could not die. The parasite says that it was a special child and they should ask it, while Lin wonders why he was still talking so much when that normally didn't happen. She replies that they were all her and that time was not linear, but he was an idiot. Lin asks if this was the time to discuss that, and if she was acting like a child because of it. The child charges with an attack, and Lin notices its speed was high, but the monster prepares another electromagnetic blast in its hand, completely surprising the boy in his form. He dodges, saying he was almost caught, and that the creature was really fast, but compared to his new form, it was nothing. The child places his hand on the ground and picks up stones, throwing them toward Lin, who wonders why he was floating and if it was an effect of gravity. Then the creature pulls him closer, grabbing the boy by the neck. Lin notices that the monster is absorbing his heat and says that this is bad, wondering if they were of the same origin. The parasite appears and says that it is difficult for them to drain each other completely, while Lin complains that she came again. Bluish arms emerge from the boy's back, pulling the creature's hand away, throwing it far. Another armor appears behind Lin, taking on a monstrous face but a feminine body. The parasite says she will have to do this herself, considering Lin's condition. The boy looks at her, impressed, while the parasite asks if he thought she would just stay inside him watching. But the boy shouldn't be surprised because with the second core, she would create another body. The child charges at both of them, but the parasite says that will destabilize the energy balance. Then she lifts her leg, colliding with the creature while saying she has no time to waste. The creature uses its ability at the tip of its foot. Lin warns the parasite that it's the gravity trick again, but she tells the boy not to worry because, since they couldn't escape gravity, they would ascend, and so she touches his chest. A bluish energy is transmitted to Lin, shattering the entire ground around them. The parasite is pulled by gravity, and the creature charges forward with its hand. However, a sword appears in the parasite's hand. Flames envelop the child's head. Then it dodges the parasite's attack, being grazed on the shoulder, leaving the hit area clean of its armor. Someone watches from a distance with binoculars and says they have found 13. Their partner asks if she was around here, and the woman replies that it wasn't too far. But the current situation wasn't suitable for recycling because she had found an interesting guy. The parasite says that this was his true power and that it was a waste to fight barehanded. Then Lin wonders if there was another function. The creature was repairing its arm, but she suddenly creates a scythe since she could do the same. The man removes his hat and says he didn't expect 13, the Holy Mother, to be forced into this state. He planned to use the chaos of the revelation to steal 13's abilities and then her head to find the agency, but he hadn't expected this to happen. Irina wants to intervene, but he says that would expose their movements and that the logistics agency wouldn't stop for a revelation. The girl agrees with Father Cross and says it was because they were chosen by the Holy Spirit. Another woman embraces Irina from behind and tells the priest not to be so serious, pressing her chest against the girl's back. She says that little Irina had been a member of the prophetic association since childhood, so taking care of one requires patience, and Irina asks where she was touching. The priest warns that Jinyu was late, and the woman says that dealing with the insects following them was difficult, so the priest thanks her for being well. Since everyone was there, they should watch the distant stage. Because the plan was about to be uncovered, the child launches an attack using its scythe. Lin wonders if it was a shockwave that attracted, but the parasite simply charges forward, calling him. He reflects that moments ago she used the attraction force to cause a massive explosion and now was trying the same thing. Then he tells the parasite to wait because it's a trick. The parasite is surprised upon getting close, being caught by a burst of attacks that she blocks with the sword. The repulsion force of the scythe sends the parasite flying far. Then the creature charges from the ground, aiming for a downward strike at the parasite's head. She is startled by the attempt, but is struck by the blow. Her scythe is embedded in the ground, but there was nothing there. Looking forward in search of the two, Lin holds the parasite in his arms and says that, as he mentioned before, she was fast. but compared to him, the child was at least 500 cosmic velocities behind him. The parasite gets up and says that this was the child's ability and not an ordinary shell, while Lin responds that he felt it. She was stronger than the other white armors. Father Cross explains that a body is supposed to be empty, but it is filled with the soul, and it was not in harmony. That's what he thought when he first saw 13. Since she was both a divine child and an empty shell at the same time, her soul and flesh were disconnected. But she was more superhuman than white armor, though still a bit of both. Jia reflects that she thought it was just her imagination, but this situation. She asks her test subject not to disappoint her. Lin just tries to calm himself and not get anxious, because she had released the attraction force before and her body parts were turning white both times. However, the bronze parts could use repulsion force. He then realizes the creature's ability. Lin asks if the parasite hadn't told him to incinerate her a moment ago, so they should increase their firepower. The parasite repeats that phrase, but with a smile, she agrees and says she understands, asking Lin to extend his hand. The young man is surprised by the parasite's action. She places his hand between her breasts, and Lin questions what she was trying to do. A rupture forms in her body, shaping the hilt of a weapon for Lin. The child charges again with her scythe, but the sword emerges from the parasite's chest. Before the child's attack can reach them, Lin fully draws the large sword and blocks the scythe, surprising the child with the sheer power, which creates an explosion that repels her. The monster crashes to the ground with its arms closed, while Lin rests the sword on his shoulder, walking slowly toward the child. The parasite advances from behind her since the left hand could release the repulsion force, so she should be attacked from the left, forcing her to use repulsion force to defend herself. The scythe begins to deform as Lin thinks that to control his opponent's attack path. This was the moment when his best opportunity to strike had arrived, advancing with his wings. Therefore, he would counterattack from the monster's right, forcing her to use the attraction force to pull him closer. Attraction force could only be used for defense, so she could only change the path of Lin's attack. In this case, that was exactly what the young man wanted because it would prove that her body was like a magnet, following magnetic flows. These flows became Lin's acceleration zones, because by adding the kinetic energy coming from his rapid speed, that was the exact moment to give his all. Lin causes an explosion in the area with his attack. He takes a deep breath after landing the blow, while the child looks upward. Lin had managed to pierce the creature with the sword. The parasite follows up with an overhead strike, aiming to deliver the finishing blow to end the battle. Cross prays for God to protect his chosen child, using his golden pilgrimage attack. Lights carry Irina onto the battlefield. Jinyu questions whether she was sent correctly since it might cause some discomfort, but the girl says she's fine and summons the holy coffin. The parasite was about to strike from above when Irina draws her sword. She says it's interesting because it's like looking in a mirror. Irina had a protective covering over her eye, shielding her. She finally unsheaths her sword, slashing at the parasite. Lin asks who this girl was as she approaches, because he thought she was a superhuman. 13 deconstructs in front of them both. Irina grabs its core with her hand, and as the parasite tries to intervene, Jinyu warns of a sneak attack. The girl flips her sword around, blocking the parasite's strike. She hurls the monster far away. Lin catches her by the waist. Irina, holding the core in her hand, says that 13 is safe, and she wants to return quickly, but Cross asks for a moment. The priest says he could see her from there and would mark her as a direct target, so she should jump when the time came because he didn't want to bring the ground beneath her down as well. Lin wonders what Irina is trying to do as the girl crouches and says it's troublesome. The young man wants to know why a human is trying to say white armor, but Irina just jumps off the ground. Cross instructs Jinyu to capture her properly. Then the woman appears, holding Irina in her arms and welcoming her. The girl is surprised to be received by Jinyu. She tells Irina not to worry about 13, but the girl curses Cross for doing it on purpose. The priest asks if she also wanted to crash into the ground when she was taken there because his ability had limits. Irina, irritated, throws 13's core at Cross, who reflects that it might take a little longer to incubate a new body, while Jinyu annoys Irina. Cross asks 13 to be a good girl and sleep in the process, since the leader of the prophetic association had told them before to move carefully, and he couldn't challenge a leader. However, he really wanted to talk to the other two who had defeated 13, while Lin says they escaped. The battlefield was completely destroyed. Joe comments that there was too much smoke, and he couldn't see the situation. Joe says it seemed to be over, and Corbin wanted to know about the monster. The doctor warns that they seem to be safe, but Maggie wanted to know about Lin Mo. The officer calls for Lin while trying to see through the smoke, wondering if Lin had gotten out of there. The young man appears and asks why everyone was looking down, because today he had to get up from the 3rd floor. In the medical room moments later, Joe questions if Lin hit his head, as it seemed like a blessing from God. The young man agrees, and Ju tells him to move his hand because she was going to take a look. Lin says he is fine and whispers to the girl that it isn't necessary. Zhao responds that he wouldn't lose anything by letting her check, then whispers back that they should act properly. Joe says that everyone being okay could be considered pure luck, but due to the shockwaves, the pipes broke outside and the heating system probably wouldn't work anymore. So after a big round, they were back to square one, but Lin tells him not to be pessimistic, since the situation wasn't as bad as he thought. When he went up the stairs, he discovered that the blood nests had disappeared, meaning they could go down to check the lower floors. But their group was the only one alive in the building, though it wasn't time to grieve, since they needed to find the former residents' supplies to block the wind and rain. So he tells Joe not to worry too much, because he would let everyone know to relocate, while Joe trembles with his phone in hand, saying that the agency wasted no time. Outside, someone knocks on a truck. The doors open, and the soldier greets Captain Pops, Sergeant Rhodes, and Corporal Lay, saying that he was Secret Agent Zion White and was there to deliver the bunker's orders to capture the superhuman Lin Mo. Corbin asks if that was what Lin meant by dirty business, while Maggie wonders if that meant they were safe now, and Joe wouldn't say they were completely safe because, after all, the situation outside was bad, since the heater was broken. Lin says they had to use this opportunity to move the base. It was the best decision, since in any case they still had the building and could use the lower floors, and the central heating system was still working. Zoe comments that it wasn't enough because they weren't just fighting the cold and needed defensive structures, and Lin says she was right and that he would do his best, asking if Joe still had some personal defense equipment in the security department, and the officer says he thinks so. Not just personal defense equipment, because before the disaster, Brooklyn's public security had upgraded its gear, and now they had some weapons and vests. So if they used everything, they might be able to take care of the entire building, though he wasn't sure if they would be effective against monsters. Corbin tries to say that he has an idea, because he discovered that if he played a certain tone, the monsters couldn't move, and that should be the power of music. Lin says that's ridiculous, and Joe agrees, making Corbin angry. The young man tells everyone that he and Kurt would go down first to check the situation while Corbin complains, asking them to hear his explanation. Lin orders him to stop wasting time, and Corbin asks for a moment. As they are being recorded, Mo says they should just inspect the lower floors, but Kurt wants to put his guitar back in its case. In an apartment, Corbin comments that he hadn't noticed before, but Lin was living really well, since he had been living in a small town in Seattle, asking if his friend was doing something illegal, while the young man asks if that's all, reflecting that, given his current situation, even the ordinary seemed extravagant, because a sudden freeze in those white armors appeared so abruptly that even living a normal life was extravagant. Even this rare moment of serenity, Lin wondered how long it would last, because after all, everyone was tired and needed time to rest. Joe looks at a card while taking a bath, realizing she needed to sort out her feelings. Maggie was looking at a photo of her father with Dorothy, because no matter how hard it was, there was no reason to give up, because even with their bodies and minds covered in wounds, they needed to survive without scruples. So for Lin, there were some things that needed to be explained clearly. He calls Corbin, and his friend asks what it is. Mo says that what he was about to tell Kurt might be unbelievable. His friend then asks why he was suddenly saying things like that, but Lin says that whether he accepted it or not, what he was saying was the truth. Kurt asks if his brain disappeared after fighting the monsters, but Lin questions whether the Lin Mo who was his friend wouldn't recognize him, and even his good friend, whom he had known for years, had become a superhuman. Kurt should have doubts about that. The young man explains that the person standing in front of him was someone who should not be alive, a Lin Mo from another timeline who had taken over the body of Kurt's friend, and the real owner of the body was no longer there, surprising Kurt with the exaggerated explanation. Lin says it was difficult to accept, and not believing him was part of what he expected, but he was telling him because he was a good friend of the original owner of this body, and after days it would only get more difficult, so he didn't want to put him in trouble by hiding the truth from Kurt. Corbin comments that he was basically a Lin Mo who never had a bad friend during childhood, and asks if that was correct. Lin is surprised by the young man's response, but Kurt continues, saying they should get to know each other again, introducing himself as Kurt Corbin, a good friend of Lin Mo. The young man just laughs at the introduction. Then Kurt puts his cigarette in his mouth, asking about all that he had just said, because in the end, he was still Lin Mo, and if this Lin Mo lost his life and crossed into someone else's body, he probably thought he sounded cool saying things like that. Lin grabs his friend's hand and introduces himself as Lin Mo, but tells Kurt not to smoke in his room, and Kurt apologizes. Outside the building, a car drives through the snow, Rhodes calls Pops an old man, asking why they should join the field workers if they were just a rescue team. The man stays silent for a second and says he knew that Agent White was being pressured by time, but asks if they didn't need to exchange some information first. White replies that there was no time to waste, because he knew what they were going to ask, and as a rescue team, they must have noticed that very little information had been provided beforehand. There was a group of humans trying to capture the target before them. It would take too long to explain everything, so he would give the main points. Because right after the freezing began, the National Intelligence Bureau activated the National Crisis Management Protocol. At that time, communications were cut off, and the execution of the protocol became chaotic. Pops says that during that same period, their team received no orders and was left on standby. But he had mentioned before that the communication failure was not a technical issue. White explains that no matter how strong the monsters were, they couldn't have destroyed the backup communication plan as well. That was human action. The commander says that thinking about it, the disaster and everything that happened was too convenient. White agrees, adding that fortunately, communications were restored. However, the Intelligence Department and the Biosafety Department suspected that this series of events had been orchestrated by a strange secret organization. Rhodes appears and says that he claimed there were no records of them in the CIA, but even the National Intelligence Group couldn't detect them. Because whether a person was alive or not, they should have respirators. He should save that story for children. She had been in the Intelligence Department as well, and a ghost organization should have left some kind of trace. White says that espers would be the correct term instead of ghosts. Rhodes asks if that wasn't the code for the operation's target, and White explains that if he hadn't gone through this himself, he would also think it was ridiculous. But the result was obvious. He then removes a pendant from his neck. He shows it to the soldiers, surprising Pops and Rhodes, who offer their condolences. White explains that the Esper organization was as secret as a ghost, but they knew they were the enemy. Pops deduces that the higher-ups believed the target was another Esper. Lee drives the car and assumes that the Esper organization was trying to recruit others, but asks for forgiveness if he was wrong. White explains that his clearance level wasn't high enough to know the details of the matter, and perhaps Corporal Lai was right, because as far as he understood, Subject Zero was the only detected Esper, and given their current situation, he was the only option for understanding. Hence, the bunker had targeted him. The car stops suddenly. Pops asks what happened, and Lee calls his chief, because there were two survivors standing in front of the truck. The captain looks through the car's rearview mirror and says it's strange, but he'll step out first to check. He gets out in front of the two and asks if they are okay, introducing himself as an agent of the National Intelligence Bureau, offering to help them. Both survivors thank him, asking for help to get out because Brooklyn had turned into hell, while White listens to the conversation, holding his weapon. Pops explains that it's a bit complicated, thinking that although they are a combat team, they have an urgent mission now, but he can't leave them behind as it is his duty, surprising the two survivors. He has a commitment to get to and informs the two civilians that there are some supplies in the car and that he can share them. Both ask about the supplies with a dark expression. Then the girl pulls out a knife, while Pops says he knows times are tough, but they should calm down as he tries to reach for his gun. However, the survivors hold him back to prevent it. The girl suddenly tries to attack with the knife, but is stopped by precision shots to the chest. White was aiming at them from a distance, landing a shot to the other man's head. Someone on top of a building has a Molotov, but White had already spotted them from afar. The person lights the Molotov, as the soldier aims his rifle at them and cocks it. With his sights focused on the Molotov, he fires again with his sniper, exploding the bomb before it can hit them. Pops manages to land a kick on one of the survivors, hitting the other with an elbow strike to the chest, while White finishes them off with a headshot. Pops pulls his pistol and shoots the woman in the chest, finishing her with a shot to the head. White notices one of the survivors coming at him with an axe, but he turns to grab the gun at his waist, pulling the trigger, and firing at the survivor with ease. He falls with multiple shots to his arms and legs, while White finishes him with a shot to the head. Pops shouts that he is safe, and the soldier does the same. Then he gets back in the car, and Rhodes asks him something. Pops wants to know what's wrong, but Rhodes questions whether they weren't survivors, saying that people are driven to madness and hoping that Subject Zero wasn't. Corbin warns his friend that he had placed it there, but Lynn is drawing along with Joe, who comments that the place could be used as a greenhouse. Kurt says that people who don't know any better would think they're doing $0 shopping. To summarize the group's plan, the east side of the third floor would be converted into a plant greenhouse, while the west side would be suitable for living. Since the sixth floor was severely damaged and the others were affected, it was safer for everyone to stay on the third. As for the first and second floors, they would be set with traps, and the security room would serve as a forward outpost or command center. But Lynn felt like something was missing. Joe comments that he could handle it with one hand when he was younger, and Corbin tells him he's bragging. The officer asks if they're going to the garage to try it out. Then Kurt accepts the old man's challenge. Lin thinks this is really childish, but Ju warns him through the communicator that he should come to her. The young man asks what it is, but the doctor tells him he'll know when he gets there. So the young man does and goes to her, asking what she needs, but Ju says that in the last battle, he had mentioned seeing his own kind. The young man agrees and says she was the one who stole the white armor's core. Zhao says she has something to tell him, playing a message from someone telling the survivors not to blame themselves amid the frost. Lin asks why she's making him listen to this, but the doctor tells him to keep listening. The audio states that in the past, God sent the flood to wash away the sins of the world. This place had always been brainwashed by the government, which monitored everything, and public and private debts were contracts forcing them to sin. But God was merciful to people, so the pure souls would be blessed. And then Jinyu finds a white armor. She touches its chest, making her hand intangible, pulling out a rocket launcher from inside and aiming at the monster. She fires, obliterating the creature in just a second. Thus, it ceases to exist instantly. The message states that the lost lambs would find hope in the apocalypse, led by the holy children. So this was judgment upon the evil government, surprising Corporal Lai as he listens to the message. Cross touches the girl's hand with his power. The message continues, warning that they should join them because the Holy Sun would protect them and absorb their sins, and then the priest would lead them to his kingdom. Zhao asks if he had any idea about what he just heard. Lin just thought it was an anti-government cult, and the blessing and the Holy Sun they mentioned seemed to be espers. Zhao says that if that's the case, it's possible. But things had gotten very serious, because for a long time there had been a human legend, whether it was the Freemasons or the Illuminati. But now, the Society of Prophets. A dark cult carried out external dirty work, but the dog bit back, infecting the Pentagon, so they created the NLSB to fight against it. This story was almost forgotten, and was something that should have been forgotten. But now the prophetic society that was once eliminated had resurfaced thanks to the ice apocalypse. Lin asks if what she just said wasn't classified information, but she had worked in the biosafety department. Zhao explains that unfortunately, she also had a terrible friend, and she was an intelligence agent, or rather, a former agent. Rhodes suddenly sneezes, and Lee asks if she's okay. The girl says that the Society of Prophets was eradicated, not dissolved, and the NLSB was not as incompetent as the CIA, so she had a bold hunch. That Society of Prophets with espers was from another universe, just like Lin, a ghost. The young man is surprised that she knew all that, wondering if she had been listening to everything thanks to the pendant on her head. Zhao exhales smoke and says it's touching and a little sweet for two men, but Lin yells that it's a bond between friends. The doctor continues, saying that if that's the case, maybe the Society of Prophets had noticed Lin, and in any case, they had an enemy to protect themselves against. She asks if he wasn't going to move, and they should help carry his things, without forgetting the ashtray, while Lin says she called him just for that. Lai turns off the radio and says that it wasn't surprising that the intelligence department hadn't found records if it was the Society of Prophets, asking Rhodes if there was any secret. The woman says it was more than a secret, it was related to the National Intelligence Cabinet, but the superiors had thoughts. However, a hand covers her mouth. Pops tells Sergeant Rhodes not to forget that she was transferred to the field department. White listens to a message saying that although communication was restored, it was still unstable and needed to be quick, because it was now confirmed that the Society of Prophets was connected to espers, and therefore capturing Target Zero was the highest priority. And to help complete the mission quickly, the superiors had decided to grant him high authority as an exception. Any form of resistance at this moment was a threat to the plan to save humanity. Therefore, having maximum authority meant he could eliminate any threat as he saw fit, and activate other agents at any time. Inside room 303, a burger is held by a hand, then Maggie takes a big bite. Dorothy comments that she didn't expect Lin to make food grow so fast, and she really could praise a burger thanks to him. Lin says that what he learned in agricultural school, and if she wanted to thank someone, it should be science. Joe opens the fridge, surprised by a bottle. Dorothy says she found it while organizing supplies and heard that Joe wanted to drink something, so she chilled a bottle for him. Joe thanks her, pouring tequila into a glass of water. Then cutting a lime in half, Joe hands the drink with salt to Mr. Lin. Lin asks the old man what that was. Joe says that the most authentic tequila should be paired with the most traditional way of drinking it, and he offers this drink to his savior, so they should sit down and enjoy the delicious food. Lin thanks him for the drink and says he wouldn't be reclusive. Then he runs the lime over his tongue and drinks the tequila with his finger, finishing by sucking on the sour lime. Joe offers the drink to the doctor, but she explains that she smokes because she doesn't drink, while Lynn starts feeling sick from the alcohol. Dorothy comments that she hasn't seen Mr. Corbin, but Lynn says he was on duty. Dorothy says she'll take his share, but Lynn says there's no need to trouble herself, though the housekeeper insists. The soldiers were watching this scene from outside. White tells everyone to prepare to check communications. This was the alpha test. Rhodes at the base says she's fine, and HQ was received, calling for Bravo and Delta. Bravo, who was Pops, confirms receipt, and Delta, who was Lie, does the same. Thus, the soldier says he'll leave the communication to the kid. Rhodes informs Pops and Lie that they were experiencing interference and that she needed to readjust. Both ask about it, but Bravo explains that the adjustment would be done as quickly as possible. Rhodes agrees and says she switched to the private channel. Pops asks what that was and why she was being mysterious, but Rhodes questions whether they should use force, since Target Zero didn't seem dangerous, and she felt that the field agent was hiding something from them. Bravo agrees with her and believes the higher-ups are involved, given that intelligence has the sense. But as her captain, he doesn't want anything to happen, so even though he says that, he won't stop the girl, asking her to be careful while Rhodes calls him again, saying that the adjustment is complete, and finally initiating the operation. Lynn pours more drink into Joe's glass and asks if he has a daughter. Joe explains that he had a family but hadn't seen his daughter in about 20 years. He was frozen outside and wondered how she was doing, while Zhao warns that he was injured and should drink less. Then Joe apologizes to his daughter for already being drunk, surprising Lynn. The man holds Zhao's hand and calls out to his daughter Juana. Zhao is surprised by the coincidence in the name but says nothing. Then he continues, saying it was his fault for not protecting his daughter and her mother. Lynn laughs and Zhu asks why he is laughing, while Joe keeps begging his daughter to forgive her father. The young man reflects that if they weren't in the middle of the ice apocalypse, at that moment they would seem like a family, but the lights suddenly go out. Lynn wonders if the generator broke, and Joe notices that something is off. Joe suddenly stands up and says the time has come. Lynn wonders where old Kiao is going, but the man remains silent. Joe simply grabs a knife, unsheathing it while looking enraged. Inside the apartment, White comes face to face with a barrier and says it's completely blocked and that it seems right. Lee asks if the informant was reliable, and Pops suggests they test it. The corporal manages to open the maintenance tunnel and decides they will go in. Bravo keeps moving and communicates to HQ that they have reached the 3rd floor. Rhodes instructs HQ to turn on the monitor because she needs video, and they should split up and search according to the plan, locating the civilians and then securing the target. White says there are only 3 of them and that they need to support the others in emergencies, and there's no need for formalities at a time like this, and the soldiers agree. They split up, with White heading up the stairs. Joe is masked inside the 3rd floor, ready to attack the soldiers with stealth. Lynn asks what the situation is now, and Zhu says she doesn't know. So the young man stays silent, looking ahead. Joe looks at him and nods. Corbin suddenly appears in the apartment and calls out to them because something big happened. Some guys with guns had shown up, and they didn't look friendly. Lee appears and announces that he is safe, and Pops does the same. But Joe suddenly collapses, still masked. Pops points his gun at him, and Lee does the same. Joe remains silent as the soldiers wonder if he's a civilian. Pops announces that they are with the National Rescue Team, and Lee contacts HQ about encountering civilians. Then the captain tries to touch Joe's shoulder, saying they are there to help, but Joe questions that help, repeating the part about being the National Intelligence Bureau's rescue team, asking since when they started doing such humane things. Rhodes recalls the mask on his face, saying it's good that the internet works, searching and finding him. The woman informs Bravo that he isn't an ordinary civilian, and the man asks what she means. Mashit, an NSLB agent, escaped from prison after destroying cartels in San Diego, using traffickers' intestines as rope, and was then recruited for special missions. Pops comments that he's one of them as he draws his weapon. Joe repeats the words "one of them," then unsheaths the knife from its scabbard, and slices Pop's hand, saying that he took the life of his jade. 2 of Pop's fingers are severed by the swordsman, who charges again, saying that he took Juana from him. Pops grabs the knife with his wounded hand. Then Joe asks how he dares to say he's one of them. Lai aims through Pops to shoot at Joe, then orders his superior to duck, firing at Joe, but the bullet merely ricochets off the mask. Joe kicks Pops away, pulling a kunai from his waist, and throwing it toward Lai. The knife moves rapidly toward the man, striking him fatally. White tries to call Bravo and Delta to report, but the communicator doesn't work, and he wonders what was happening. Lynn appears behind him and says that despite all this snow and wind outside, people were still invading other people's homes. White tries to draw his pistol, but as he goes to fire, the man had already disappeared. Lynn tells him that he is a noisy intruder. White introduces himself, saying that he is an agent of the NSLB, and that he is there to capture Lin Mo. The young man vanishes again, leaving only traces behind, asking if he was going to arrest him, because that was interesting, as he wasn't concerned about the ice, only about capturing him, wanting to know if it was his duty to maintain order after the collapse, or if he was still hiding something. White turns again to shoot at Lin, telling him not to challenge him because he really would fire. Lin says he'd better be sure he could actually hit him. With that, the man fires his sniper rifle, activating its absolute precision mode. Lin dodges the bullets using his acceleration and rushes forward, striking White's head with just one blow. The man's focus device falls to the ground. Lin notices that something was off, because he had clearly aimed at his head, but White says it was close. But luckily, his intuition had always been sharp, and Lin must be wondering why he didn't twist his head. His intuition told him the trajectory of Lin's attack. Simply put, he could even predict if Lin was going to fart just by the way he lifted his butt. Lin asks who the hell he was, but White activates a similar ability and asks if he hadn't already told him, because he was the National Intelligence Bureau agent Zion White, and people called him an Esper. Rhodes tries to contact Alpha, saying she can't see his screen. She whistles, trying to reach Zion, calling HQ and requesting reinforcements. Lee panics, shouting for reinforcements while yelling that he and Pops had been hit. Several knives fly toward the pair, striking their backs and vests. Joe slowly approaches the fallen duo, while Lei points his weapon at him. They are surprised to see that the man is no longer in their line of sight. Then Joe suddenly appears behind them. Stones hit him out of nowhere, saving the two. Lin collides with his old friend Joe. He reflects that he was careless just as a creature invades the room. Lin looks back, wondering who he bumped into, but soon smells alcohol and realizes it was the old man, Keo. The young man helps show up and asks who the two of them were. Pops asks them to listen to what they had to say about their identities, but the creature stomps its foot on the ground. Lin explains that they need to deal with that guy first. Pops just reports to HQ through the radio, asking if it was an empty shell and informing them that he had made contact with one. The creature swiftly moves its pupil downward, preparing an electricity attack against Pops. But White pulls the strings and orders it to wait, stopping the creature from moving its arm. Zion explains that Lin Mo was the target. He warns Lin with just a look, while the young man grits his teeth, preparing for combat, responding that it seemed like a tough and unavoidable fight. Then he gently places Joe on the ground and apologizes. Since he owed him another drink, he begins transforming into a monster. White says it was expected from Subject Zero, and seeing it with his own eyes was still shocking. But Lin asks if that meant Zion knew something. The monster lunges to capture Lin, however he simply activates his acceleration. Seeing the attack in slow motion, Lin looks back, thinking he couldn't fight there, clenching his energy-infused fist, and striking the sound barrier to divert the blow. The creature is startled by this. White wonders if that was a sound barrier and if Lin really managed to deflect attacks using it. Lin charges toward the two, leaping from the third floor with the creature. He strikes the shield again, questioning whether it was made of energy. A dust explosion erupts as the three hit the ground. Lin rises, saying this was going to be complicated, since the monster itself was a type of power, but the shield was the biggest problem. However, he still didn't see himself as completely without hope, noticing chains, so he decides he should capture the leader first, while White tells him to give up because everything he does is futile. Lin crouches and generates his energy wings and horn, thinking that speed was his advantage and yells, how would he know without testing it? Launching off the ground with force, destroying everything in his wake. White dodges, asking if he hadn't already said so, since his intuition had already foreseen the trajectory of Lin's attack. But he is surprised when he looks to the side. Lin was running chaotically to keep them from knowing where he was coming from, so he says that since White can see the path of his attack, he would create more paths to interfere with the soldier's intuition. Since speed was his advantage, and as long as he's fast enough, he can always find White's weakness. White destroys the chains and repeats that speed was his asterisk advantage, and he was very confident. The creature looks to the side with its broken chain. Then its forearm forms a blade, preparing to charge forward as well. White says that Lin wasn't the only one there with a speed advantage. The attack wounds Lin Mo. He wonders what is happening. As the creature rushes to attack again, he notices that despite its size, it is still fast. Thus, the monster thrusts the blade from its forearm, surprised by the boy, because its strike didn't hit his throat. Lin holds the blade, saying it was too close. White tells Lin Mo to stop resisting, pointing his weapon at Lin's head, because dragging a corpse in that kind of weather was troublesome. Lin says not to talk to him like that and wonders if the higher-ups would allow him to die there, since White was just a dog of the National Intelligence Bureau. Some fragments of stone rise from the ground, surprising White as he notices the shards, which come together and form something. Lin knocks the weapon aside, and the shard structure finishes forming, making the boy run toward it. White tries to keep aiming at the monster, but Lin was already close to the sword, gripping its hilt tightly, and causing a massive blast of destruction behind White, who wonders what is happening. Because as soon as Lin grabs the sword, more lightning appears. His face partially turns white. Then he pulls the shard sword from the ground, spinning the hilt and revealing it's actually a spear. His armor, now in blue and white tones, prepares for combat. Lin plants the spear into the ground and says they should begin the second round of battle. White thinks intelligence was right. Lin had evolved steadily, and if it continued, things would only get harder. So he should end it quickly and couldn't let Lin evolve more, raising his arm and saying he'd fight a bit. The creature forms another blade from its forearm, launching energy slashes at Lin Mo. The boy watches the attacks, thinking the doctor mentioned blue meant absorption. So he spins the spear defensively, blocking the attacks like a shield, but his spear turns reddish, changing the entire color of the armor to a deep red. White wonders what is happening. As Lin prepares to throw the spear, he hurls it at maximum speed toward the two of them, destroying everything in its path. White realizes he not only dodged the attack, but also converted it into his own energy. Noticing the spear approaching his white armor, it prepares to receive the blow. The spear strikes the barrier in front of it, gradually turning the barrier red. Lin says the strength of the field can neutralize both, since the spear was made of black shard fragments and can generate the same force field after absorbing energy. But unlike the neutralizing soap bubbles, once force fields cancel each other out. An explosion erupts in front of the creature, sending it flying behind White. The soldier wonders how this could happen, since his white armor had been knocked out by the blow. White sends the creature back into the barrier, saying it was hurt and could return to rest for a while. He wanted to know if Lin was going to continue. The boy explains he wasn't stupid and couldn't do anything about White's intuition, but without a pet, White couldn't do anything to him either. White repeats the part about being a pet. Lin points the spear, saying they were at a standstill, and White repeats it, wondering if Subject Zero had been mistaken, because he should look at himself, since he resembled the white monsters that come from the snow and ice. Still, Lin thought it was a standoff, but White didn't see it the same way, so he yells for his partner to do something. His partner starts playing the guitar. Lin looks back, recognizing the sound, while a massive speaker blares. The boy asks what's going on because his head is hurting. The blonde person begins to sing, continuing to play their guitar. Lin notices the parasite was resisting the music, but the song says to wake up when September ends, and so the parasite begins to leave his form, falling to the ground separated from Lin Mo, and closing the eyes of the boy who reaches out for the guitar. Corbin was in front of him and held his hand. White warned that he was late, and Corbin apologized, wanting to know if he missed anything exciting, and White agreed. But none of that mattered since the mission was complete, thanking Agent Corbin for the help. Kurt told him not to mention it. 30 minutes earlier, he accessed the computer, sleepy while taking a nap in the surveillance room, watching the recording of the agents breaking in, and then opening the surveillance room door. White pointed a gun at Corbin's head, frightening the young man because of it, since he was sleeping and now awakened by 3 men. Kurt stated there were no hidden herbs and that he had stopped that a long time ago. White started saying strange things to Corbin, making the young man repeat the words in a trance about the bad boys unit. White said it was the weapon's answer, and Corbin responded that it was 21, answering and saying he was ready. Light questioned what that was, but Bravo explained they were field agents, also known as secret agents of the bad boys. Corbin banged his head on the keyboard, now unconscious in front of White. Bravo questioned what was happening and if Rhodes did this, while Lai didn't know. Rhodes replied that he didn't, and the facilities were old, but he couldn't control them remotely, so it was likely a malfunction. Corbin suddenly woke up. White stated they needed to apprehend Subject Zero Lin Mo and rescue survivors as per the briefing, but they needed their current location, and Corbin picked up his phone, asking them to wait. Since with the power outage, Subject Zero and the survivors might have moved, it was better to split up. And when apprehending Subject Zero, their firepower wasn't enough to capture him, but he had a way, so he needed something first. Maggie asked what was going on and why Mr. Lin had left as well. Then Maggie found a camera, and Dorothy asked what it was and if they were monsters, but Corbin denied it. Joe noticed what Maggie was taking from Corbin's box. Maggie apologized and the doctor approached, asking what it was. She noticed it was a camera, and on top of that, it had the address of the National Intelligence Bureau. Corbin pointed his gun and ordered the doctor to raise her hands. Dorothy asked what he was doing, but Corbin continued, saying she was the head of the Anti-Bioterrorism Combat Force. Zhao said that he had been the bad guy, but Corbin shouted at her not to toy with hope. The doctor drew a gun from her jacket. Then Corbin fired at her. The bullet from the gun was hot, but it fell to the ground in front of Zhu. Dorothy and Maggie were frightened on the floor, but Zhu kept walking with only her hair touching the ground. Corbin said she should restrain herself because he wouldn't miss the target next time, so she should keep her hands where he could see them and turn around. Zhao complained that field agents were always so heavy-handed, now with her short hair. She asked if the main target was her test subject and if he was pretending to be his friend while monitoring him. though he probably didn't have those memories. Corbin questioned what she was talking about, but the radio reported that Alpha was not responding and Bravo and Delta were injured. Corbin stated he had located survivors and asked if the wounded could be transferred, because there was a doctor right there. Bravo asked how they were, but essentially, they had not lost their lives without complications. However, their wounds had already been stitched, so he shouldn't worry, since it wasn't anything serious. Asking if Rhodes could use the private channel now, and she asked what it was. Joe told him to say thanks and asked what that meant. Corbin asked what she meant, saying he was a traitorous agent, and maybe this freezing was related to them, the traitorous agents, asking what she thought it meant. Joe simply said that they were the ones who had betrayed them, shouting about Project Europa. Corbin was startled by the mention of the project, but the doctor explained she was referring to Jupiter's second moon, and in the past, scientists thought it was the most likely place in the solar system to harbor life outside Earth, but it was a frozen planet, asking if he recognized it. Because just like New York now, she asked why he thought the superiors used that name for the project, and it had nothing to do with NASA, but rather with the Society of Prophets. Corbin swung his arm at the girl, pointing the gun at her and saying that was enough. Joe asked if the field agent was in a hurry, but Corbin stated that if she didn't have studies on Subject Zero, she would already be dead, saying something inaudible to Zhu. Pops looks to the corner without showing any reaction. Then Corbin slaps her. He informs the HQ that he would make the Alpha return and that they should prepare to receive survivors. Then Zhu asks what he was afraid of. It was already dawn outside the building. Lin was restrained, and the soldier referred to him as a packaged parcel. Light questioned what would happen if he woke up, but Corbin told him not to worry, because even if he woke up, it would be useless since he wouldn't be able to use his powers for a while. A sufficient amount of insulin had been injected into him, thanks to the research of the traitorous doctor. Corbin informs Lai that he would carry him, and the young man agrees, apologizing to his unconscious and gagged friend. Lai asks his boss what they would do now. Pops only wanted to know why he had joined the National Intelligence Bureau. The corporal wonders why he wanted that answer all of a sudden, but Pops realizes that he might be involved in something terrible. White asks how the injuries were. Because he had good news, the main communication had been restored, and they had just made contact with the nearest shelter to a hospital, though it was a bit far. Lai thanks him, saying that was great, but White explains that there was something else before they left, asking if they saw a monster in the apartment that resembled empty husks. Lai denies having seen anything like that, and White asks the lieutenant, who also denies it, saying that aside from the civilians, there had been no other notable encounters. White says that's very good, thanking his rescue team colleagues, saying it had been a pleasure working with the group, and so they leave. Cross asks why Jinyu didn't act immediately, and she responds that after cutting the power, she noticed there were rats among the flock of sheep. And then among the rats, there was a wolf, so she waited for the fight to end before acting. Cross replies that in that case, he and Irina took care of everything. Jinyu puts on glasses, saying it was in the name of the Holy Father. The truck drives away. Maddie calls for her mother inside the car with Zhu, Corbin, Dorothy, and the unconscious Lin, asking what was wrong with her big brother and why he was tied up, and even the medical sister and Uncle Joe, while Zhu asks about the old man, who then questions when she changed her hairstyle. Maggie wants to know why they were crumpled if they weren't bad people, pointing her finger at Corbin next. He is surprised, and Maggie asks what happened to her guitar-playing brother. Dorothy tries to say that he was still Kurt, but the little girl denies it, saying that he wasn't. Joe laughs at the situation. Annoyed, Kurt asks what she was laughing at, but the doctor explains that many times only a child's perspective can see the truth about this country, and he agrees, saying that the nickname Guitar Brother was fitting, while Corbin takes it as an insult. Rhodes notices smoke and calls his father, noting that he had started smoking again. Lee tries to reassure his senior not to worry because the sergeant was just anxious. Rhodes asks about his injury, and Lei explains that he was fine, because compared to the surgeon's wounds, he had nothing, since now, a soldier couldn't hold a gun, just as that country couldn't save anyone. Rhodes says he will register the identities of the survivors, and Lei questions whether that was necessary. But Ju is surprised to see her friend. Rhodes asks if she is Jo Shuya, but Ju replies that it had been a long time since she saw Joanna, and that she had really gained weight. The girl throws a tablet at Corbin. Zhao asks if she was demoted to the field department and still in the logistics team, or should she say the rescue team? But Rhodes points a gun at her, and Ju asks why everyone was doing this today. The girl questions who was responsible for her current situation because she thought they were friends but shouldn't have trusted Ju back then. Zhao asks if she didn't find the truth she was looking for, as they both knew the risks. White looks inside through a window, telling Rhodes to calm down for a minute. Since they had a motorcycle pursuing them, a camera captures its movement. Jinyu accelerates the motorcycle while using her ability. Rhodes asks what that person was. Something wasn't right, wanting to know if she didn't feel cold in this temperature. Zhao warns that she's an Esper, They absorb ambient energy and maintain low temperatures for long periods, while Rhodes asks if they still move at absolute zero. The doctor agrees and says they have adapted to freezing. Jinyu pulls a revolver from her chest, calibrating it while driving and pulling out another one, aiming at the truck with it energized, causing a massive explosion in the area, forcing the truck to fall. Everything inside the location shook rapidly. Jinyu threw the weapon away, saying she missed the target. Lai wondered what had happened and if it was a grenade, but Pops ordered him to drive faster because she was getting closer and closer. Jinyu pointed her pistol at them again, while White opened the back doors of the truck and started shooting at the motorcycle. Jinyu reloaded her weapon with energy, frightening the soldier with the damage it would cause, but it was launched toward him rapidly, causing an explosion that overturned the truck, crashing it into a building. From within the smoke of the explosion, Jinyu emerged, still riding the motorcycle, stopping it using her leg. She drew her revolver again, saying that this time she overdid it a bit since the truck had fallen off the bridge. The truck, which was vertical, returned to the correct direction. Then the woman's revolver started to fragment, disintegrating in her hand. Jinyu questioned how the durability reached its limit so quickly, and Irina asked how things were on her side since she had already finished along with the priest. Jinyu explained that she needed to check on the package's situation, while Irina questioned if it shouldn't be easy for her. The woman explained that nothing was going as planned and that she was talking about the package, but her partner said she was just being lazy. Lin Mo was still gagged. Rhodes said that if she had to do this again, she would collapse, asking if everyone was okay. But Joe explained that dealing with Manhattan through Rich wasn't easy. White asked about Subject Zero. Corbin said he was fine, and Rhodes asked if the agent was only worried about him, considering he wasn't the only one in the car. Joe approached Joe and asked if he was okay, and Joe replied that he was, but he wanted to know about Miss Perez and Maggie. Dorothy and Maggie were still okay. White asked if there was something Rhodes wasn't understanding, since her only mission was to take Subject Zero back to the bunker, and as for the rest, that was what her team was supposed to handle. Rhodes asked what he meant by her team. Running toward the driver's cabin, Rhodes called for the rookie and her old man. Lai said he was fine, just had some scratches on his face. Rhodes shouted for Pops, noticing that a stake had pierced his vest. The agent told her not to rush as he had seen worse situations in Iraq, while Rhodes moved in to help. Bravo explained that he wasn't going to die, but he wanted to know what that was, because in his vision there were several people, including a car's headlights. Pops said that was what he meant by worse situations, referring to the hundreds of white armored figures. White admitted they were in trouble now and that it was the first time he had seen so many empty shells, but since they were focused, they could try to take them down. Then he asked if Corbin's speaker was powerful enough, while Corbin asked if it was loud now, since it wasn't a matter of power as his guitar was broken. White shouted that they would have to use the primitive method, shooting at the creatures. Corbin asked if there was another weapon in the car, but Rhodes told him to check for himself, approaching Zhao, who asked if she needed something. Rhodes cut off the doctor's handcuffs, surprising her for helping a traitor. Corbin asked what she was doing while handing Zhu a first aid kit, telling her not to get the wrong idea as he hadn't forgiven the liar, but the current situation required her to do what she did best, helping her father with a serious wound in the lower abdomen. Zhao said it was a bit difficult alone and needed someone to assist, but Dorothy volunteered, since she worked in the medical field and could help but needed someone to take care of Maggie. Maggie said she could take care of herself and didn't need anyone to look after her. Corbin tried to offer his help, but Maggie refused, and he said he would keep searching for weapons. Joe asked to be untied because he would take care of Maggie, and Rhodes asked if he was the headline uncle, but he denied it, saying he was a security guard. And the current situation was not the time to follow rules since they had all survived so far by helping each other in that lousy apartment. A pale creature tried to attack Lai through the car window. Then the agent drew a knife from his vest, piercing the monster's hand and neck. Rhodes pointed a shotgun barrel and told him to cover his ears, quickly firing at the creature, which destroyed its head. Pops said he didn't expect to see a doctor twice in the same day, while Joe told Dorothy to apply pressure to stop the bleeding. Dorothy couldn't stop, and Joe noticed that an artery had been hit. The situation was very bad. Jinyu suddenly appeared behind White. He turned around, saying he had forgotten they had pursuers behind them. Then the woman pulled a katana from her chest. White realized she was also an Esper, wondering who she was while Jinyu advanced with the sword, and he aimed his gun. Dorothy applied pressure to remove the stake, but it wasn't enough. Joe noticed that if she continued pressing like that, but she was surprised as she suddenly remembered something, seeing a scene from her childhood when she was helpless, since she had the key to breaking the situation. Then remembering Lin Mo, Jinyu advanced with her sword toward White, forcing the soldier to activate his intuition with both eyes, and then he avoided the woman's attack, but his gun had been shattered because of it. Jinyu said his blessing was interesting and asked why a saint would help a sinner. White questioned the idea of sin and said that term might work for a country bumpkin, but he was an atheist and suspected the woman might be from the Society of Prophets. Noticing that her goal was Subject Zero, while Jinyu asked if they would do this in a way he could understand, asking if he didn't want to go back. White asked what she was talking about, but the woman explained that he was also an Esper and should know that he wasn't originally an NSLB agent. Or rather, he didn't belong to that world and should still have things that mattered to him. White remembered the things that mattered to him, asking what he really cared about while recalling a police officer who had once asked if she could work with her senior again. White lowered his pistol, saying she was right. But some people had lost their lives in the past, and now there were some still alive, so it didn't matter which side he belonged to, because he just wanted to say the side where the things he cared about were, and he wouldn't let Subject Zero fall into her hands. Lin Mo was still unconscious when a bullet fell on him. Joe and Corbin fired at a creature while the guard told Maggie to cover her ears. Kurt asked how the rescue team was doing when he saw Joe, but the doctor suddenly looked down, removing Lin Mo's protective vest. Kurt grabbed her hand, asking what she was doing, but she told him to look at the situation now, because there were several monsters outside waiting for a snack, and an Esper relentlessly chasing them, so this wasn't a situation they could handle. The bullets simply entered Jinyu's chest. The woman advanced with her sword, and White complained that the bullets should have hit, while Jinyu suddenly seemed surprised, saying that this was the place, breaking the ceiling when she touched it with her katana, and falling right on top of Lin Mo. She looked forward, excited, seeing the people who were taking care of him. Joe asked why Corbin was still hesitating, when a white skin suddenly grabbed Jinyu's leg. Corbin said he would use magic to defeat magic, so Jinyu stabbed the white skin with her sword. Corbin injected insulin into Lin Mo's neck. Jinyu was close when the white skin's blood dripped onto her body, but Lin suddenly woke up, wriggling inside his straitjacket. The woman said she was there to retrieve the lost saint, while Lin Mo just stared at her, still gagged. Jinyu told him to wait and suddenly recognized him, being thrown away by the force of an explosion. Lin Mo fell to the ground on his knees, wondering what was wrong with him and why he was weakened again and masked. Zhao removed the mask from his face, saying she had given him a glucose injection, and asked how he was feeling now. Lin Mo asked if she had changed her hairstyle and said it was good to see her, but Zhu told him not to change the subject. Then she smacked his head, asking if his brain had fallen asleep foolishly. Lin stood up, his stomach growling, and said the energy didn't feel enough. Zhao complained that she wouldn't give him more, because their lives depended on Lin Mo at that moment. The white skins kept screaming, but their heads were blown apart by bullets. Joe complained that there were too many, and they were difficult to defeat. Joe asked if he had anything to eat, preferably something high in sugar, but Joe said he was at the age of diabetes. The woman reflected that most of the glucose had been left in the apartment, and he couldn't fight like this, while Lin complained about feeling dizzy. Suddenly, Maggie pointed at a chocolate bar. She said it was the bar her father had left for her, but she wasn't hungry now. Lin reflected that she didn't know about her father, but he denied it, saying that it was what her father had left for Maggie. Maddie told him to take it because good children should help others, while Dorothy tried to make do as she treated Pop's wound, and Rhodes questioned if she could handle it. Then Lin should quickly eat the bar that Maggie was giving him, and he agreed. The young man noticed the mark and said that bad memories were coming back, but he ate, saying it wasn't the time for that. There were more important things. Joe stood face to face with a pale creature, but he realized he was out of ammo, cursing his situation. Lin rushed toward his friend, surprising Joe when he looked back. Then Lin clapped his hands, disintegrating the pale creature, completely destroying it with ease. Joe noticed that he had obliterated it with just one clap, and wondered if it was a sound barrier effect. Lin smiled and said he was starting to enjoy this feeling. The monsters were frightened by the display of power. Then Lin stepped on the guts of one of them, noticing that there were many pale creatures, trembling in fear, but he felt something different about them, wondering why they were running from him. White was astonished and wanted to know what was happening, because the pale creatures were fleeing. The tablet stated that Agent White was past his deadline and should reveal the status, but he explained he had some problems. Jinyu commented that even soulless empty shells could feel fear. Since they were originally human, it made sense to fear the most powerful holy child, and Lin questioned who she was. Han Jinyu introduced herself and asked him to join them to fulfill the mission entrusted by the sacred girl through the Lord. Lin refused, saying he had more important things to do, while thinking that this was the anti-government cult the doctor had mentioned. Jinyu reflected that the pastor had ordered her to prioritize bringing him back. Then she moved her hands to her chest, saying that in this case, she reached into space, drawing another fragmented katana from her power. Lin wondered if her ability was to pull weapons from her body, and what the cracks were, since they seemed like layers of emptiness. Jinyu excused herself to Lin Mo, charging at him with both katanas in hand, aiming to cut the man down with the black sword. launching an upward attack with both weapons. Lin questioned what was happening and if she could have more than one ability. But he noticed something strange about the shards, denying that possibility. Because the shards were crumbling, he grabbed a shard with his hand, preparing to throw it while thinking he should give it a try. The projectile blast caused an explosion in the area. Lin was suddenly surprised, wondering how her body absorbed the attack and if the crack led to some kind of space, while Jinyu explained it was her first time seeing a hole in her stomach. She asked if his attack was just a test. Then, according to the pastor's description, the young man's capability should be much more than that. Lin asked if she was provoking him while realizing she was right. Joe noticed that Lin's situation wasn't very promising because, although he could move normally, he had only recovered 13%. In other words, the parasite inside him was still dormant. Lin reflected that facing an opponent who was also an Esper, besides the power difference, was a battle of abilities, and capability was the trump card. Then he said the lady shouldn't provoke him like that while thinking that since he couldn't use the black fragment, it was like losing an ace and one could never predict tricks. Since he had already made one mistake, he needed to be more cautious now. And at that moment, his situation felt as if he was about to be strangled in the forest at any second. Jinyu lunged with another kick attack, which Lin avoided. Both of them charged at each other. The woman wondered if he also dodged the aerial attack and realized it was no longer a matter of speed. Lin reflected that she didn't just feel like a snake, her attacks were exactly like one, so he could only try to overpower her, throwing a punch. The strike caused an explosion in the battle area. Jinyu was unscathed after being hit. Lin was astonished by the result, because his arm had entered her chest. Jinyu commented that it was the first time someone had entered her body like that, and Lin realized her power was spatial. The woman lifted her heel from the ground, moving closer to Lin as she wondered how far he could enter, and Lin felt he couldn't use the sound barrier at this range. She had been curious about this before and felt that Lin's gaze was familiar to her. Lin was startled by this as she embraced him and said he was the speaker, expelling him forcefully. Lin's arm shattered due to the attack, but the pastor warns Jinyu to stop what she is doing immediately. Because they had received the NSLB at the base and were holding the head of 13 with great force, this was her chance beyond the orders of the speaker. However, the speaker had also received a revelation, and they would find Lin again. Jinyu complains that good times were always short and that they would have to stop there. She sticks out her tongue and says that next time, she will make sure he learns the words of the prophet. Then she clashes her two swords together, causing a massive explosion in the area. Lin tries to observe through the smoke, but they notice that she had escaped, and something about it seems strange. Joe approaches, asking if he is okay and what the current situation is, while the young man says he is fine, and that they were safe at that moment. A helicopter descends from the sky. Lin questions what they will do now, and Joe realizes it is a helicopter, which was descending towards White, who comments on them finally arriving. The helicopter lands, stopping its rotors on the ground. The soldiers step out and order Alpha 1 and 2 to rescue the civilians, while the others should follow the plan. They place Pops on a stretcher, and Rhodes asks who they were, while one of the soldiers introduces himself, saying they were colleagues and thanking them for their hard work. Rhodes looks back surprised, while White salutes and says he didn't expect his boss to come personally. Frank simply states that his soldier did well, and he thanks him. Then the light from their weapons shines on Ju and Lin's faces. The doctor asks why the security department was on a bunker mission and even brought high-ranking officials, while Lin is just confused. The soldiers say that Subject Zero is under control for Frank, who is the head of the strategy and decision department, and Barbara is the leader of the biosafety department, who comments that this was unexpected. Joe calls out to her friend Barbara. Then Barbara responds that she'll see her in hell, and now the situation seemed clear. Zhao comments that her and the bald idiot from the Department of Fools showing up there wasn't a good sign, and Barbara asks if her image was really that bad to her. Either way, Frank intervenes to explain, stating the reason why he and Barbara were there. Since Subject Zero, Esper Lin Mo, was necessary to uncover the truth about the freezing incident. The young man asks what that has to do with him, but Ju stops him, telling him not to believe Frank's nonsense, because all he wanted was to continue Project Europa. Barbara questions that name, saying she had never heard of it before, and she wants to know what the bald man was hiding. Frank simply asks how Ju knew about Project Europa, looking startled. The doctor reveals that she was right, and Lin questions if she was just trying to get information out of him, to which the doctor confirms. Frank responds that since she had left intelligence, they couldn't execute her due to her contributions to the country, but a gun was aimed at her from a distance, firing at the woman while using a silencer. However, Lin intercepts the shot, protecting his friend. Frank wonders what was happening. Lin tells the doctor to wear a helmet next time she tries to extract information from someone, and the woman responds that at least she still had him. The young man asks if they were trying to silence her for touching on a sore spot, because this was exactly like the movies. Barbara grabs Frank and asks if the freezing incident and all the other events were connected to Project Europa, and why he hadn't said anything, but Frank simply responds that she would find out. Just not at this moment, so the soldiers should take her away, while Barbara asks what the headquarters chief was doing. Joe tells Lin to be careful because he still wasn't fully recovered, and even his body was at its limit, with veins spreading over his arm. Lin reflects that if he could use all his power, dealing with these soldiers would be easy, while Frank orders them to hunt down the woman. At least the others were safe while the civilians were captured and taken to the shelter. Then Lin remembers his promise never to run away again. He grabs Joe's hand, calling the doctor, because she should hold on tight, and she asks if they were going to repeat the process from before. The soldiers start shooting at them, but Lin escapes, leaving only a trail behind. Frank wonders how he was so fast, while Barbara frees herself and calls him Baldy, reminding him that she had already warned about Lin's speed, but the bald man didn't even pay attention. Frank turns, saying that Joe must have gotten hurt. However, he is struck in the groin by Barbara, who says that without Subject Zero, they were doomed. Destroyed, Frank questions what to do if he should chase after them, but Barbara orders them to forget it and return to the bunker because there was too much they still needed to learn. Lin soared over the buildings with Ju, crashing into a window and breaking it. They fell into an apartment with a lifeless body. He coughed and asked if the doctor was okay, while she replied that she was. But his condition was really bad, bleeding from his eyes. Joe looked through the supplies and assured him it wasn't that bad, while Lin wanted to know what she was doing. She tossed a milk carton, and the young man questioned what it was, noticing that it was freezing from the inside. He wanted to know where she was getting this from, but Joe said they had won the lottery, since the man seemed to have been lifeless for a long time, and the cause was a gunshot wound to the chest. As for the killer, it seemed like both had fought each other. The survivors probably fought over resources, but they should be grateful to them because that's how they won the lottery, a blessing in disguise. Lin, distressed, commented that other people's sadness was his luck, just like before, and she asked if something was wrong with him. But the young man simply said he remembered the past. She repeated that it was all in the past. Then she smacked his stomach, telling him to focus because he should be eating now, while Lin asked what she was doing. Joe put onions, potatoes, and packaged milk into a hot pot. She commented that it wasn't strange since they were in a Chinese restaurant, so it was normal to have ingredients, but if he was complaining, he should look at the two on the floor. Lin said he had no objections to the ingredients, but it was weird to throw everything together in a big pot like that. The woman asked if food didn't need to be cooked, and the milk thawed since it saved fuel, but Lin said she misunderstood the meaning of efficiency, wondering if it was possible that the doctor wasn't good at cooking. Zhao said she was a doctor, not a chef, so she didn't need to know how to cook, throwing a potato at Lin's mouth and saying that it was the end of the world, yet he was still picky. A woman watched them from a distance, while Zhou commented that given Lin's physical condition, this was the most efficient way to replenish calories. The girl repeated to herself not to be afraid. Zhou told Lin to eat quickly because they weren't on a date and it was cold, while the man spat out the food, saying it was burning hot. She commented that Lin's body was adapting to the frozen environment, but she couldn't, and the protective suit wouldn't last much longer, so she needed a place to recharge its energy. Zhou noticed something behind Lin. Then she drew the pistol from her jacket, asking who was there and telling the test subject not to move. The girl trembled in fear of the gun, tripping over the corpse in the room, and then dropping her baton into the air. The baton struck her on the head. Zhou approached and asked who she was and why she was spying, but the girl said she meant no harm and wasn't a monster. Since she was a survivor like them, her name was Penny, and she was there to gather supplies. Penny had just seen a fire and came to check the situation, so if they had nowhere to go, the fortress where she was staying was nearby and could shelter them. Zhao said it sounded like a trap, but Lin recognized the girl, while Penny tried to insist that it was true. However, she then noticed that it was Mr. Lin, who often bought cigarettes and lived in the Fang apartment, so she couldn't be mistaken because of his earring. Lin repeated the part about the cigarettes and realized she was really Penny from the convenience store, thinking she was someone he knew. The girl grabbed his hand, grateful that he was alive, saying she had heard that monsters attacked the apartment, while Lin thought of her as a social butterfly. Penny led them to a subway station, and Lin asked if this was the fortress she had mentioned. It was a good hiding place, and recent survivors avoided monster attacks by going underground, while Zhou commented that the transmission had harmed those who hid. However, it was clear they had made modifications since they needed to be prepared, but it was the station chief's idea, and Lin asked about that role. Zhou noticed graffiti on the wall, and the young man responded that it was Brooklyn, so it was normal. But she was talking about the new graffiti, wondering if that was an eye. Penny urged them to enter quickly, and Jo said she had seen that before. The young man apologized for bothering Penny. Then, as they walked in, the wall revealed something written, that the Son of God would save them. Penny asked to introduce them, saying that this was New York's G subway line. Lynn commented that the place was a little strange. Then a woman, praying, asked if Penny had returned and brought new people. Penny says it was enough for the month, but her friend warns her of the danger, even if it was to help the divine child, while the redhead only wanted to know about the station chief. A woman in boots approaches. Penny greets the station chief, who wore a beret over one eye and walked with armed and masked guards. The chief asks if Penny left the hideout again. Penny responds that this time she just wanted to finish the quota quickly since her brother was sick and she wanted to do her part. Then, putting that aside, she had found new survivors. They were her former neighbors and she knew the situation of the apartments, while Lynn wonders if she was the Lou Delam of that place. But Ju tells him not to jump to conclusions. The station chief approaches, saying she had noticed that, but they should follow the usual rules. The soldiers surround Lynn, and he asks what she is doing, but the chief tells him not to get nervous, because it was just a quick inspection, and Lynn questions what exactly she was going to inspect. The woman shines a flashlight in his eye, impressed that his pupil was circular. Then she says it was impossible, and that he was, kneeling and welcoming the sacred child. Lynn questions what is going on. Zhao responds that they must be members of the Society of the Prophet, and Lynn comments that she got it right, but Zhao doesn't find them hostile and thinks they might not be the same group. The chief says they had been waiting for him and that the saint possessed a holy ring. Since the apocalypse began, they had been hiding there with no one to save them, believing they had been forgotten, but the empty husks kept appearing. At first she thought the gods didn't exist in the world, until the day she saw the robed ones, and that was the first time she witnessed a miracle and saw the saints with her own eyes. Since that attack, they converted to the prophets, sheltering those wounded by the apocalypse while the saints returned to their mission, so the survivors were worried. But before leaving, the most venerable of the saints prophesied that a saint possessing the eye of the sacred ring would come there, and they had been waiting for the prophecy, wondering if it would really happen, never expecting to actually witness it today, since the survivors needed the saint and his appearance had given everyone hope. Lynn asks about hope, since it was the most important thing in this apocalypse. Then Penny brings food for the saint. He looks at the plate, impressed. Even the food had eyes drawn on it. The chief says that offering the sacred communion was a duty, and as a saint, he should prioritize his combat power as he was the only one protecting them in the apocalypse. Zhao says they risked their lives for the sacred communion and on the surface saved people for the Society of the Prophet, and Lin responds that this was hypocrisy. One of the priests says they were running out of food and should distribute the sacred communion now, but she whispers that it wasn't the time to talk about this, and they would resolve the situation later because they needed to keep the saint to protect them there. Lin thinks that the leader, Penny, and the survivors had been deceived by the prophets, and his appearance only strengthened the false belief, because he had been used without realizing it, and that was frustrating. He had something to do, so he calls the doctor. Zhao waves at him and tells him to wait, because even if he exposes the lies now, they wouldn't believe him, and Lin says he knows. But she has faith in the cunning, and he wouldn't do something so stupid, so the doctor should trust him because he has a plan. Zhao asks what plan that was, but Lin approaches, calling out to the leader, who introduces herself as Hannah, and asks what she could do for him. The young man says he was the hope of her faith, and she agrees. Then he asks if there was something he could do to help them. Smoke drifts through the train lights. Zhou comments that his plan was to help them build a cultivation chamber in the subway, ensuring basic food supplies, to repair the power and heating so they wouldn't freeze in the dark, and to help expand the platform, so Lin should now be called the virtuous saint, saying he was a kind saint. Lin questions since when kind became a derogatory term, and Zhu responds that he was too gullible for having been revived, but he was naive for helping the society. The young man says that the doctor was wrong though, surprising her with that response, as Lin continues, saying that they were the ones who trusted him, and it wasn't kindness that made him help them. With his understanding of the body, she knows that using abilities consumes energy, which is why they created the sacred communion. Then he asks if she remembers when they first met, because if it hadn't been for her, he would have died of exhaustion. But back then, she had long, soft hair. However, Ju interrupted him, smacking his head and telling him not to change the subject. Lin said he wanted to do the same as the Prophet Society because they would work for them, and that was the difference. He wasn't relying on deception and exploitation, but rather on the kindness she wished for. Zhou became furious with her friend. Lin said he would stop joking, and she told him to get straight to the point. The young man said he was very gullible, but in reality, it was the opposite. Because even after the disaster, he still trusted everyone and never expected everything to become some kind of cycle. If he had trusted Ming Ming and told her the seeds had sprouted, maybe she wouldn't have chosen Lu Dalong. And Zhu reflected that it wasn't strange to like agriculture. He continued, saying that after deceiving himself and thinking carefully, the things he had discovered stemmed from humanity's weakness in the apocalypse. And because of it, people became sensitive, trapped in chaos, some turning selfish. But he didn't want to be like that. Zhao commented that precisely because humanity was weak, they should unite. And his age was the time to bring everything together, as productivity was the key to the apocalypse. She grabbed his collar, saying that people had the power of unity. She moved closer to his face, saying she would be right in front of him, and Lin questioned what she was about to do. The woman said she wouldn't do anything but had changed her opinion about him. While Lin commented that she was very close, Penny suddenly interrupted, calling for the saint, but she fell to the ground due to her clumsiness. The girl tried to get up and announced that she had found something incredible under the subway, because after the power was restored, they discovered a maintenance passage there. At first they thought it was just a maintenance passage, but further ahead, it didn't seem like something one would find in a subway station or a maintenance tunnel. Lin asked if it was a door, and wondered what it could be, but the doctor told him he was right. Penny started rambling about doors, and Lin told the doctor that the NSLB had installed themselves there, and the woman responded that it was noisy. He went up to Penny and turned her around, telling her to inform everyone not to come for now because he would investigate the door. Joe picked up an agency card while Lin told Penny to wait for news. The door authenticated the identity, and the doctor complained about how slow old things were. Lin questioned whether it hadn't been abandoned, but she said she was technically retired. But this wasn't her card, it was Rhodes. The young man asked how she got that without a car and started to understand the attitude of her former colleagues. But Zhu commented that she had to shear the sheep. With the door open, Lin told the lady to enter first, and Zhu said he was very polite. Zhou analyzed that the energy system was old and manual, but at least it was powered independently. Lin asked if she knew what the facility was, but the woman didn't either and suggested they take a look to find out. The young man looked between the grates, running his finger over them and seeing dust. He said it had been there for a long time. There was no silence or ice, but since they were underground, he wondered if there was some kind of continuous heating system there. Lin told the doctor that this place was strange, and she agreed, saying that everything there was old, but the layout seemed recent. The young man questioned what this place was for, but the doctor was surprised, because there was a control room full of NSLB monitors. The young man wondered if it was an NAA base. Zhao explained that they had hidden a base within the civil installation, and Lin wanted to know if the national budget had all been spent there. However, the woman started tinkering with the computer. The system requested the protocol code, and she tried to recall one, noticing something different all of a sudden. Then she entered the Project Europa code. The system stated that authentication was successful. Then it began preparing to update the system, surprising the doctor. Lin suddenly stood up from the chair as the update reached 11.3%. Then it jumped to almost 80%. Finally finishing, the online icebreaker project system announced that they could now break the cold. Zhou asked what this was for, but the system warned that voiced inquiries were being monitored. And the answer was that the icebreaker project was part of Project Europa, designed to monitor freezing events and assist agents by providing optimal actions. The system was integrated into the giant ice network, so it had only activated in the Brooklyn section and some functions were offline. Jir repeats that they could overcome the cold and deduces that this is about the NAA. Lin completes her thought, saying that they knew about the global freeze in advance. The doctor slams her hand on the panel, saying that the NSLB was hiding something so huge, and that nothing really changed, as they had no idea how many lives were lost due to confidentiality. Lin notices that Zhao's reaction is not as rational as usual, and her relationship with the NSLB must be more complicated than it seems. From the freeze to the espers and the empty husks, all the questions were connected. Lin looks ahead cautiously, trying to analyze Zhao Shriya's state of mind. He asks what she is thinking. Zhao denies it, saying she was just remembering the past. But Lin reflects that even after all this time together, he still doesn't know much about her, because Dr. Zhao Shriya, who was both rational and mysterious, was also fragile. She asks why Lin is staring at her. But embarrassed, the young man says he was also thinking about the past. However, the system suddenly plays a warning. Lin sighs, grateful for the system, but Zhu immediately instructs the computer to report the situation. The railway transit route was crowded with civilians. Zhou questions what was happening with those people. Even Barbara was there. The system announces that the estimated arrival at the platform is in 30 minutes. Zhou then reflects on why Barbara brought so many people there, and whether it could be related to the accidental activation of the icebreaker. It would be better to ask in person. Lin asks where the doctor is going, and she says she is heading to the tunnel to meet her old friend and figure out what is going on. The young man says he will go with her in case they encounter empty husks. The tunnel temperature was extremely low, and it was recommended to wear protective suits for hazardous environments, with 2 usable sets available in Zone B. Lin comments that the system was really smart, and Joe questions if the budget was spent on this, but she was the one who should change, since the battery on her suit was close to running out. Lin asks why he had one too, but then he gets hit in the forehead by a briefcase. Joe says it was less ridiculous this way, and Lin responds that he had already adapted to the freezing environment, so it wasn't necessary. The girl explains that he needed to maintain a normal body temperature to function properly because if the heat ran out, he would just be a living popsicle. She opens her suit while explaining that the protective suits provided safety in extreme environments, were lightweight and highly expandable. So for Lin, they could reduce heat consumption outside of using abilities because they monitored his body in real time and prevented him from overusing his abilities, while Lin was only thinking about the doctor without clothes, wondering what exactly had happened in the past for her to have those scars. Joe notices his gaze, then turns to him, asking if he heard what she just said. Lin is just thinking that she has large breasts, while the doctor questions if he is daydreaming. She looks down, realizing. Then she turns to Lin, saying she understands. Since his ability hadn't affected his normal desires, she would take note of his preferences, and so he is sent flying, excited. The doctor tells him not to move, as this would only take a moment. Then she presses something onto his chest, applying strips. Lin questions what that was, and the doctor explains that they were repair patches. Applying them could cover the Nania logo, as people might be sensitive to that, so they should avoid problems. He comments that it feels like a second skin, and that he can already feel the heat loss decreasing. While Zhao holds a pistol in her hand, Lin is ready for combat. They both set off, and he asks how her hair got shorter, but Zhu dodges the question. While a camera records the two of them, the loudspeaker plays an emergency announcement, telling the brothers and sisters located on the west track to temporarily evacuate to the east, as the west track would be temporarily closed, thanking them for their cooperation and asking that the Holy Spirit bless them this winter. Hannah asks Lin if he transmitted the message correctly, and the young man thanks her. The woman apologizes for her presumption but wants to know if there is something on the west track. Lin reflects that he couldn't mention the Nenia personnel, as it would cause conflict, so he responds that it was safer to stay away from there due to gas leaks. Hannah accepts the answer from the Holy Son. Then the young man reassures her that the closure was only temporary, and after the investigation, things would return to normal. The woman pulls something from her pocket, saying that since he was going to investigate, he should take that radio, because she had tuned it to the central control channel, and he could contact them at any time. But there was something else, as his tape had come loose. The woman touched his shoulder, saying that everyone trusted him, because the holy children who came after the speaker only wanted sacred communion, but he had truly helped them. Lin told her not to worry because he wasn't going to run away. Then the tape was back in place on his arm. She asked the Lord to light the path for the holy child and for Zhu. Lin commented that the power supply to the section had been cut, but the doctor told him to wait, because they were approaching the estimated location and should hold on. Lin put the flashlight in his mouth, and she asked what he was doing while the young man tried to fix the lighting there. He touched the generator, saying he had learned to fix things in a parallel world. Turning on the train car's lights, Lin said it was expected from the New York subway, but the doctor said it was a new line. However, she told him to be quiet and look over there, surprising Lin with the view. Since there were hundreds of people standing still, waiting for something, Joe commented that most of them seemed to be civilians and wanted to know why they were just standing there like that. But then she noticed Barbara among the civilians. She had a lifeless expression. Then Joe shouted, asking what she was doing bringing civilians, while Lin told her to wait, because that was very strange, since initially the people were on the platform, but now they were facing them, and there must be something unknown at work. Barbara simply trembled her legs without speaking, moving toward Zhu, and opening her head, revealing herself to be an empty shell. Zhao was shocked by this, as the face of her friend turned into that of a zombie. Lin shouted for the doctor to be careful as soon as he noticed it was an empty shell, but Zhu fired toward the creature, completely surprising Lin by doing so. Zhao had emptied the gun's magazine. Then she tossed the empty magazine aside and drew another, loading and rearming her weapon. Zhao said she was a little rusty, while Lin questioned if she called that speed rusty, wanting to know if her former colleague had turned into an empty shell. Zhou denied it, saying he hadn't transformed into one, because those were empty shell mimics designed to deceive people. The mimics opened their heads, surprising Zhou as a light began to shine. The creatures opened their chests, spreading the glow, forcing Zhu and Lin to cover their eyes. As the woman shut her eyes, Zhao remembered her colleagues telling her not to look back. Wondering what this was, Barbara commented that it would fit perfectly, and Rhodes said it was the birthday present they had bought for Zhu. However, the cake was fake and made with 3D printing, apologizing that the laziness department hadn't approved vacations or funding. Zhao simply thanked her friends with a smile. Lin said that no matter how fast he was, he couldn't run faster than light, but he was surprised when he looked ahead, because all the mimics had turned into Zhou Shuya, shouting at the test subject that they were the real one. Lin said this was going to be complicated. The women kept shouting that they were the real one, and Lin became confused. But Ju pulled the earring from her ear, ripping it off, throwing it toward her friend. Lin caught the earring in his hand, noticing that it was the doctor's earring. He thanked the doctor for her help, clenching his fist, but she was still relentless with herself. Lin rushed toward the hundreds of mimics, saying that the doctor was crazy but very effective. Then he advanced with his foot off the ground, destroying all the fake Xiaos in his path, saying that he was familiar with the fact that empty shells had blue blood. Joe kept talking to Lin, asking if he had some kind of special fetish because every time she ended up covered in the empty shell's blood thanks to him. Lin apologized to the doctor, but she threw something else at his hand. It was the other pair of earrings. Lin tried to speak to the doctor, but she said it was a gift because there was no real reason. She had wanted to throw them away 3 years ago, but now she couldn't use them as a pair anyway, so she might as well toss them to him since they had no trash bins. He thanked her, wondering what kind of reasoning that was, since it made him feel like a garbage can. Joe looked to the side, hesitant. Then Lin noticed the doctor's expression and wondered if there was a story behind the earring. But it wasn't important now as they needed to figure out why the monsters were there. Joe told him to stop getting distracted and help her look, while Lin asked what she was looking for. The girl said it was the core and a vesicle he had seen before, because it was the same as the one that had been absorbed into his body, and the young man wondered what kind of discoveries had been made about this. Joe asks if he remembers the hive-type empty husks that destroyed the apartment since they had no core. Lin agrees and says that the progenitor body of 13 had a core. Then he questions if the empty husks without a core were descendants of a more powerful one, and Ju explains that the parent continued producing new offspring, because going back to these monsters, they were indeed coreless descendants. If they had a core, they would have found it by now. Lin asks if that was really the case, and she questions what he meant. The young man finds them in the tunnel strange. They seem to obey orders, but only descendants without a parental body could mimic, as if someone had placed them there. However, someone approaches the duo, asking what kind of joke this was, and what was going on there, demanding to know if she was responsible, while Lin groans in annoyance, recognizing her, and Ju asks who she is. Irina says that there were finally mimics there, but thanks to the two of them, the plan was completely ruined, which was infuriating. Cross asks Irina what happened, and the woman calls him back. She shouts that just thinking about it makes her furious, because the mimic she was supposed to defeat was snatched away by those two, but the person on the communication channel says they both could handle it. She denies it, saying that one of them was just an ordinary person. Zhao raises her gun, calling the girl foul-mouthed. Irina suddenly takes a deep breath, saying that so that's how it is, because that was Subject Zero, and she questions what Jinyu was doing, but the priest says she just had bad luck today. Cross warns Irina not to act rashly because the speaker emphasized avoiding contact as he had his own plan, but the girl takes off her earpiece, saying that such insistence was irritating and that her plan was ruined. She stomps on the earpiece, now completely enraged. Then she prepares her sword, saying that everyone loved to give her orders, but she didn't care about any plan, and the two of them needed to get out of her way. Irina charges forward with her sword toward Lin. Zhao fires a few shots at the girl, but they are easily dodged thanks to her agility. The doctor complains about wasting bullets, but the attack is blocked by Lin Mo with his bare hands. Irina grits her teeth, calling him black. However, Lin Mo transforms, saying that since she chose to fight, there was no reason to avoid combat. Thus, he transforms into his monstrous form. His mask becomes part of his face. Irina comments that he looks different from their last battle, since now he had hair and had become just armor, and even Zhao is impressed, questioning if the test subject had evolved again. The young man wonders what is happening because it feels different from the last two times. The parasite appears, fused with his suit, its most complete form yet, but it warns that he is not the only one with this power. However, Lin wants to know if it has decided to emerge. Irina grows a tail at her waist, saying that it wasn't just her, repeating that the situation was interesting. Now with a cat-like grin on her face, she transforms into a panther, telling him to show his true strength. The woman charges, and Lin wonders if all she thinks about is fighting. Because a psychotic girl remains the same even in the apocalypse, he forms claws in his hands. Irina pulls a pistol from inside her vest, firing at Lin while holding the sword in her mouth. The young man dodges the bullets with his claws, slicing them into pieces without even thinking. Irina orders him not to dodge if he has any courage, while Lin calls her a wild cat. Thus, their fight becomes a battle of speed and evasion, with Lin provoking her. Irina tries to attack again, and the young man notices an armor-like defense. He lunges with his claws, striking the girl in the chest. He is surprised by the result, because once again, his attack was intercepted by a shield. The parasite remembers her and says that this was what blocked its attack before. It was sure it wasn't a normal shield, but Lin signals that they are in the middle of a fight. Irina grabs the sword from her mouth to slash vertically, aiming it at his right leg, and then kicking toward Lin Mo. Joe says that she knows what that shield is, and Lin asks how she knows, but the doctor explains that she wasn't just watching idly during the fight. There was an electromagnetic force between the molecules that prevented fusion and deflected bullets instead of blocking them. Therefore, the ability was to manipulate that force. Then her extraordinary movements reinforced the theory, because following that logic, she could manipulate the force between herself and the air molecules as well as the ground. Lin asks her to wait, because the tips of her fingers spun, and they were starting to turn red. He asks the doctor if this force was a form of energy, and she says it could be converted into one. The young man states that it was very good and that he knew how to break through her shield. Zhou notices his reckless attitude and mentally urges him to wait, questioning what he was talking about, while Irina attacks him. Lin defends against the strike using his reddened claw. Then he realizes that it was just as he expected. His opponent spins 360 degrees to strike him again. She steps back and asks what was wrong and if he had decided to stop dodging. But Lin looks behind, calling for her, asking if the girl was ready now, with a scar on his eye, because if she couldn't hold on any longer. It was his turn, advancing toward her with his crimson claws. Irina is surprised by his action, being struck before she even realizes it or can do anything. She says that even though she has her coffin of Sada, her speed doesn't mean, thinking that Lin Mo now had clones attacking her from behind. Irina reflects that it was an afterimage of high-speed movement and questions how this man is so fast. Noticing that now he had turned completely red, even his face had taken on that color, and she asks how it was possible that her energy was being drained, because Lin Mo was absorbing all her power just like a vampire. Zhao analyzes from a distance and says that the piezoelectric effect was actually, when certain materials are subjected to mechanical stress, a charge separation and potential occur, which is the polarization of crystals. In simpler terms, it can generate electricity. The shield amplified the force between cells and converted attacks into mechanical stress, keeping them weak as long as the defense exceeded their intensity. Lin Mo's claw grows larger and sharper, because this type of high-speed attack allowed the subject to absorb energy. In other words, the shield had turned into a coffin of its own energy. The young man states that in this world, no shield is impenetrable. Then Irina curses him, asking why he was always ruining her plans. Lin questions the plan, wanting to know what she was working on, and if she was controlling the empty husks outside, and if the freezing was related to them. But Irina smiles, saying she understands, because he knows nothing. However, if he wanted to know the answer, he should see it for himself. As she transfers her veins to him, Irina submits her parasite to Lin Mo. Then the young man suddenly opens his eyes, finding himself as a spectral figure in that moment. Lin wonders if that was Brooklyn before the freezing, but it seemed different from what he remembered, wanting to know what it was when he notices a pistol in his field of vision. White is holding someone in his arms while wondering how he became a police officer and who this woman was who had been shot. While there is a girl standing in front of White, she realizes that the person is Irina and her parasite connected, bringing her there. But there was a door beside the girl. Lin steps through the door and someone says they would lead the station servers to Irina, reminding her that they are more useful alive. Irina agrees with the speaker. Someone looks at Lin Mo, saying that some rats have entered, and the young man wonders if these aren't just memories, wanting to know how it was possible. But the hooded figure is himself, calling him Mr. Thief. Lin questions how this could be and how he could talk to him if he was inside memories, since that man was another version of him. The young man asks who that monster was, but the figure asks if the boy doesn't already have the answer. Lin reflects that he is right and simply cannot understand, because that was the true owner of the body he currently inhabited in this parallel universe, asking why he was still alive. The other Lin asks if he thought that by transmigrating, his soul would simply disappear, apologizing for the disappointment, but he had not vanished. Then he removes the hood, surprising the original Lin Mo. The speaker says he borrowed the empty husk Lin left behind and got to know the boy earlier than he had planned. Lin reflects that those were the same scars as Lu DeLongs and wonders if the apparition and ability to speak with him were part of his power, along with his plan. But the man says he doesn't mind revealing it, since Lin can't do anything about his plan. Moving behind Lin Mo and gripping him with his claws, telling him that he would accelerate the freezing process. He drives his claw in, saying that he had no other choice and that his time was up. But Lin Mo should think of it as a welcome gift. The young man wakes up suddenly, remembering that he had returned, and the scene felt familiar, with Irina saying that he understood nothing. But he kicks Irina away. The girl asks him to let her finish speaking. However, he points the pistol at her head, making the girl ask when he stole that. Lin Mo demands she answer without tricks, questioning what she meant by accelerating the freezing. Irina asks where he heard about that, but the young man says he would tell her one last time, so she should answer his question. Irina responds that it's fine, she will tell him, but he should hold the trigger firmly without hesitation. The speaker chief wanted to accelerate the freezing without explaining. Lin questions the reason, but Irina only wants her promised time reversal, because she had some personal grudges knowing that he and those lunatics only had aligned interests, but she didn't care about what happened after the freezing. Joe questions if that was what they called out of sight, out of mind. Irina asks if he is saying that if they don't intervene, the world will end. The doctor mentions the doomsday theory, assuming the world is doomed to destruction, while Irina points to the freezing as proof of the planet's end. Zhao says that the test subject claimed that everyone lost their lives and asks Lin Mo what he thinks. Lin asks if it isn't obvious because even if it's just to live a few more days, they have to stop them. Irina asks if they heard what she said about stopping them. Then she wants to hear what the plan is. Zhao asks if they are brainwashing refugees to use them as slaves to work for them, and the woman asks what was wrong with that and if there was a problem, since those fools deserve to be their slaves, because the weak should be subordinate to the strong, and they lose the ability to think with false hope. But it was funny. Lin pulls a radio from his pocket and asks if they heard all that. Irina is suddenly surprised. Then the young man tells Hannah to respond if she heard it, and the girl calls out for the Holy Sun. Lin questions if she recorded the conversation just now, and she confirms, because she transmitted it through the station's central control to all platforms of the G-Line subway in New York, so everyone should have heard about it. Lin questions if she had just asked how they were going to stop the prophetic society, but the first step was when civilians discovered that everything was a lie, because that way they would destroy the false hope she built. The men removed their masks with glaring eyes, stepping on it in rage against the prophetic society. Hannah rips the bracelet from her arm. Then Joe says his test subject was very clever for thinking of that. Lin wonders if she always made him look dumb, but he replies that this was probably the value of having lived twice. Irina starts laughing, and Zhu asks why, but she responds that it was too late, because they talked too much. Then she suddenly emits a glow. Joe questions if he hadn't absorbed all of her energy and what was lighting up, but Lin doesn't know either. 30 minutes earlier, Hannah asks if Lin Mo has another request, and the young man remains silent, thinking that she must have noticed but didn't expose him. He says he has something to ask her, and the woman should answer sincerely, and she agrees. The young man asks if Hannah believes in the Society of Prophets, but Hannah responds that yes, and not just her, but all brothers and sisters believed, but Lin rejects her answer, telling her to answer sincerely because she understands what he is really asking. Hannah is surprised upon realizing the true meaning of the question. Then she accepts that she should be honest, responding that she doesn't trust them but believes in Lin Mo. However, many were devoted Christians, and she could only maintain order and avoid collapse, because it was strange for a stripper to want to help others while wearing a revealing outfit and playing the role of the last order, but station chief was a bad title. Lin responds that Hannah is incredible, and it isn't ridiculous, because anyone would want to help others within their abilities. And without her, the station chief, he couldn't even imagine what the station would be like, because she just said that she also wanted to free the group from the Society of Prophets. And now what they needed to do was let them know the true purpose and not worry, because he would figure something out, but she needed to cooperate. Besides, she should stop calling him Holy Sun, because he has a name, and it's Lin Mo. Lin says that, just like last time, she was trying to escape while Joe opens fire. Both shoot at maximum speed at Irina, trying to send her beyond, piercing the woman with several bullets. However, Lin orders them to cease fire when a light appears. They are surprised by the magnitude of the light. It explodes shortly after, with Lin holding onto Zhu. Both fall side by side. Lin is still shocked by the explosion, and Zhu warns that it was close. Getting up, the girl asks what is happening, and the man responds that she should remember what he said after the last fight, because that had been the teleportation he mentioned. Outside, in the isolated city, Cross walks through the snow carrying Irina's wounded body. Irina says nothing, and Cross remarks that even though Grace can repair her body, the girl apologizes, and the priest is surprised that she can even apologize for her actions. However, Irina raises her middle finger at Cross, telling him not to get carried away. Then she apologizes because she lost to the black-haired guy and tells him not to inform Han Jinyu, as she would only become more annoying, but Cross just tells her to rest. Lin is startled as he looks ahead, wondering why he feels this way. The atmosphere is entirely wrong compared to what he expected, and the people in the subway look downcast. Lin tries to talk to them, but he wonders why they are like this, and if all of them are afraid of him. Zhao asks if he has guessed the reason, and the young man agrees. Lin says that naturally this was bound to happen, because in a collapse of faith, people become paranoid, and paranoia breeds restlessness and suspicion, especially in this apocalypse. Then he says that he has experienced this firsthand. He tells the people that they must already know that the empty shells deliberately attacked the fortress, put the saints on display, and enslaved them. One of the people asks what the point is in listening to Lin, since both he and the others are holy sons, and a girl pleads with them not to say that. Lin responds that he understands why they don't trust him, but he is just feeling a little restless, while thinking that this is a problem. However, he is not like them because he is not trying to enslave them. A man shouts for Lin Mo to prove it, and a woman tries to stop him, while Jiu asks what they should do since the people are not welcoming them, and whether they should fight, but Lin refuses. He says that resorting to violence, while it may provide an immediate solution, would still leave people unsettled and could even escalate things, causing trust and prestige to vanish. Zhao asks what he intends to do in this case, because this will devastate the people, and Lin says that it will crumble from within, just like it did to him in the past. Suddenly, Hannah fires into the air, shouting for everyone to be silent.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.